Yes, hello, let's try that again. Thanks, everyone. Yes, I was muted. Hopefully you can hear me now. So welcome to the stream. I'm talking about near-death experiences, specifically the Pam Reynolds case. So in the video that Nathan and I did last week, we talked about near-death experiences with respect to the arguments made by Habermas and Inspiring Philosophy, with respect to the arguments they make about the evidence for NDEs as being evidence for substance dualism or for the resurrection or whatever else. And we went through a bunch of studies and considerations relevant to those. Now, the Pam Reynolds case did come up there, and we did talk about it briefly, but because I think it was Habermas who mentioned it. Well, actually, I've forgotten now, but it was only mentioned briefly, so we didn't cover it in a lot of detail. And some people in the comments raised some objections about our analysis, which was incomplete. So I wanted to sort of address some of the concerns there. Also, Nathan did I think it was the same day, actually, I guess it was a panel discussion with Dr. Jan Holden, who is an NDE researcher, and the Pam Reynolds case was also brought up there. So I thought it would be also interesting to review some parts of that video as part of the discussion now. And it looks like we might have Nathan joining us here.
Hello. Let me... A bit too close up, wasn't I?
Yeah, so I don't know if you caught my amazing 1 minute muted intro, which was fun for everyone.
No, I was hearing you. I heard you say... I must have not, if you were muted before that then.
I just reset everything. It's all good. All right, so I've got a bunch of stuff sort of prepped, and we'll sort of see how we go with the order here. So what I found, first of all, is a video from a few years ago just discussing the Pam Reynolds case, which I thought we could watch as an illustration of how this case is typically used. Then I think what I'll do is go through some of the panel discussion that Nathan was on, just in the part where they talk about NDEs and Pam Reynolds is brought up. And then I'll work through some of the papers that I've got lined up to address some of the specific issues that are brought up there. So that's the basic plan we have. Nathan, did you want to make any comments before we get started?
I guess something that I don't know how many people have seen various bits and bobs of some of these things that we're going to be looking at, but I wasn't really familiar with the NDE community before we did this, like bad apologetics, and before having any of these conversations and things. And I do find it really fascinating, like the parallels that can be drawn between the way people will like argue for NDEs, the way people will argue for like a demon possession case or a miracle, or is really, really interesting, because these things are almost always at some level it's like a personal testimony, and then we've talked before about how there's always like I was really skeptical and rational, and then I came around, and then there's like how can you explain this on naturalism kind of repeat. It's really, really interesting. But it's what I find weird is that these are then like segregated communities from each other, and like they'll reject each other's claims, but then they'll use like the exact same strategies to accept their in-group's claims. I don't know. It'd be cool to do more like research on the psychology of like what's going on with all that stuff, because it's pretty weird and interesting from my point of view.
Yeah, and just the video I'm about to show, I was just looking at the channel that it's on. I'll share screen now so you can see what I'm talking about here. Wait, oh no, I've already shared it. How does this? Oh, it's a specific tab that I've shared, not Chrome as a whole. So I'll have to reshare for that different tab.
Right.
Still learning.
And get the share audio.
Yeah. I remember that one now. Oh, it looks like it is. Oh, and the share audio is only on the one tab. So if you miss that, oh, blast. Now what's going on?
I can see your whole...
No, that's Firefox. Yeah. Oh, dear. We'll get there. Pro streamer here. I've got too many tabs open. That's the problem. Okay, no, this is the one I want. Share audio. Why is that on default? I do not know. Great UI design. Okay, so...
Create UI design just in the middle of the stream.
All right, so can you see that one? It should just be black at the moment. See it. All right, good. It's working out. And if I go to a different tab, you can still see that, right?
Yes, right. That's right.
All right, so this is the channel that this video is on.
Oh, wow.
Just look at this.
Yeah.
Some of this artwork is just bizarre. Cosmic Thoth DNA magic, Metatron DNA, the matrix of like all this stuff. But see, the interesting thing is then if you look at the comments on this video, it's a bunch of Christians. It's like God and his angels are real.
Yeah.
What is it? People and foolish choose not to believe in God. God loves us beyond all doubts. So there's these Christians going on this video and taking this as evidence for some sort of afterlife or
Yeah.
whatever.
But if they knew what this person believes, they'd be like, Satan.
Yeah,
like, look,
exactly.
Isn't
It's such strange bedfellows. Anyway, so let's just watch this short video, and it will be, I think, a good intro to the case.
I can't hear audio right now, if you can.
I did share audio.
Was there audio on that bit? It might.
There is.
Yeah.
Let's try again. Share audio is ticked. StreamYard, Google Chrome. Over to this one. Let's try again. There's no audio on that bit.
Okay. Yeah, right. I can't hear anything now if any audio's happened yet.
Yeah, there's a bit of a delay, so just let me know if the sound is now working. You hear any of that?
No, I didn't hear any of that.
What is going on? It's...
Do you have
I
it
don't understand.
muted? You know, on the StreamYard. I can't see, like, there should be a little audio. See how next to me there's like a microphone. There should be like a little audio thing next to the share that you can mute and unmute.
There isn't. Why isn't there? Share screen, share audio. Okay, let's try this. Maybe it will prefer this way to share it. Jeez, this thing is so annoying. All right, let's see if it works this way.
From unlikely sources.
Yes, got it.
All right, I'll do it that way from now.
A stunning array of scientific instruments and measurements were in place at the very
Glad you're
moment
here, Nathan.
of Pam Reynolds' death. The results were astonishing. At age 35, Pam was diagnosed with a life-threatening brain aneurysm. Her only hope was a very unusual operation. In order to fix the problem and to save her life, doctors would have to drain the blood out of Pam Reynolds' head. What's more, her body temperature would be lowered to 60 degrees. Her heartbeat and breathing would stop completely, and her brain waves would be flattened. Doctors who performed this intense procedure have nicknamed it standstill, because for all intents and purposes, Pam Reynolds would be dead. But what happened was so thoroughly unique and unexpected, Dr. Michael Sabin, a cardiologist and the author of Life and Death, made an extensive evaluation of the Pam Reynolds experience.
The process of death, scientifically, now is known to be a process and not a point in time. It starts with normal waking reality and ends up in irreversible death. During this process, the body dies at different rates. The problem we have as scientists and physicians is to determine when the brain is actually dead, i.e. when the person is actually dead.
In the case of Pam Reynolds, one of the surgeon's main concerns was seizure activity, which could prove deadly during such a delicate procedure. To guard against this and other complications, Pam's brain and body were extensively instrumented and monitored, which makes what happened next even more intriguing. Pam told the doctor she left her body and became a spectator to what they were doing to her body. Later, she was able to describe people, procedures, and even medical instruments she could not possibly have seen.
Pam Reynolds had a very deep near-death experience at the time that she had documented no brainwave activity, no brainstem activity, and actually the blood had been physically drained from her head at the time. So this eliminates the possibility that this was a seizure phenomenon, because during her experience, she had no seizure activity on the EEG. In addition, she had plugs in both of her ears, and so she could not have physically heard what was being discussed in the operating room during the surgical procedure, and she could recall the accurate discussions that were going on between the surgeons at the time that she was having her experience.
Remember, every bodily reflex was being monitored. She was in a profoundly inactive state. But Pam Reynolds somehow was able to describe a particular surgical tool in amazing detail, a tool which she would later say looked like an electric toothbrush with a dent in it. She even noticed that the tool had interchangeable blades and that these were kept in something that she said looked like a socket wrench case. How could Pam Reynolds have described with such amazing accuracy the details of what took place in the operating room when she was, according to all monitoring devices, dead? Dr. J.P. Moreland, professor of philosophy at Bible University, finds this kind of experience compelling.
The most provocative evidence for heaven from near-death experiences seems to me to be cases where people come back from near-death experiences and they have information there's no way they could have had if they had just had a physical experience while on an operating table. For example, some people come back and they're able to recount conversations that their relatives have had 5 blocks away from the hospital. In other occasions, people have actually had experiences of objects on the hospital roof or somewhere else, where when people go to investigate whether those experiences were real, they see the objects just as the people saw them. In other occasions, people have met dead relatives that died about the same time the person died in the near-death experience. And they came back and reported the death of a relative that no one there in the operating room knew about. Now, this provides pretty strong evidence that something more is going on than just a lack of oxygen to the brain.
Oh, yeah.
There's this Christian apologist going on about it, and then there's this Buddha statue that just appears. Let's awaken together. It's just the juxtaposition's amazing. Yeah, the video's a bit fast, so sorry about that, but you know, I'm an impatient person, so I wanted to get through it. There's a lot of misinformation in that video, but in essentials of how it's presented, that's a good presentation of the Pam Reynolds case. I didn't actually know JP Moreland was in the end bit of that. I didn't watch it through. Yeah. So anyway, some of the key claims that are made about Pam Reynolds is, first of all, that she had no brain activity at all when the NDE occurred. So it could not possibly have been due to some sort of dying brain or lack of oxygen or whatever else, that she was able to see and hear some of the saw that was being used to open her skull, and that she reported a conversation between, I think, two of the doctors, or a nurse and one of the doctors. And although I don't think it mentioned it in that video, that she correctly reported one of the songs that were played towards the end of the operation. So those are some of the key claims, most of which you heard in that video. So I'll get to those in a little bit, because I wanted to start with sort of showing you some of the claims and then response to the claims. So Nathan, did you have any quick remarks about that video before we go on to the discussion that you had with what's her name? I keep forgetting her name.
Janice. Yeah.
That's
her name. Something that's interesting is, obviously, there's a very similar scene to that in the Surviving Death Netflix documentary, which is trending on Netflix right now. But they use different surgery clips. And I find it really, really fascinating how, for me as a viewer, you have this, it's kind of like a ghost story around the campfire being told about the Pam Reynolds case. And then the visuals kind of prime you for how you sort of come to interpret the story that you're being told. And for example, when they talk about the socket wrenches in, they had they always say that, there's I've got a box that's kind of full of socket wrenches for this instrument. I forgot what it's called, the specific kind of saw that's like a toothbrush. But they use it. It looked very different in that scene to the one that's in Surviving Death. The one in Surviving Death was golden in color, different metals used, and different style and stuff. And I just find it interesting how even between people who seem to be presenting this kind of pro case for NDEs, it's those are different instruments that they're actually presenting in the scenes, but the story can be told in the same way. So you don't really need to be clear, particularly clear about the details of what's being presented. It can be, vague enough that, it's kind of like a buzzing drill, sounds like something a dentist might use, or but visually you can compare that against the one that's in the Netflix documentary. I'll see if I can actually bring it up really quickly, because I don't know if it'll. Maybe this is a bit of a moot point, but I just find it funny how that you sort of interpret what's going on through the way that they kind of present these visuals and things, but they differ from retelling to retelling.
Yeah, and just with that little clip there, I thought about something that they show you the case that the instruments are kept in. Well, I mean, not the exact one, but I guess something like that, and say there's no way she could have known what it would look like. And I was thinking, well, I've just seen it on TV.
Yes.
So I know what it looks like. Is it impossible that she could have seen one on TV at some point prior to her operation? It seems that these most basic skeptical points just fly by some people. Anyway, that's not one of the most significant
no, it's not
evidential points. It's just a funny little thing that and the shoe on the roof as well, which isn't the Pam Reynolds case, it's a different one. But again, that it's like they got a photograph of the shoe where it's not. That's a humor reenactment that was done, and they don't really explain that when they're showing you this. It makes it feel like that it's much more better evidence than it is. Did you have that clip you wanted to show?
Yeah, I don't want to play it, but I'll play the stills, because I don't know if playing Netflix will get the stream pulled down. But that is, the type of saw, that is the doctor himself saying, you might use the
said he can't understand.
you see the
Oh, yeah.
yellow as well. Like it's a different. That's different to the thing that was shown in the other one. But just with the description, it's kind of like a sorry thing that's like a toothbrush. You can kind of like get away with the description, kind of like it's the same thing in when it's just said like that. But it could be very different. She's not like what colors are it? What are the colors of it? What are the dimensions? It's just kind of vague enough that.
Yeah, it's illusory detail. You think she described it exactly, where basically it's just like, it looks vaguely like a screwdriver set. She could have seen that anywhere. But anyway, yes, that's really interesting. Let's turn now to this conversation. Now, sort of not entirely sure which bits to show. I was listening to it before, and I think you might be able to help me since you were there. But I think we'll start with.
Right. It's going to be the first section. Will be that first episode that was on the NDEs. So.
And because I don't actually care about the review of the episode, I don't know why they're focused on that. See if I can get this right this time. Yeah, hopefully this is working. Okay, so we'll play through this. There's some interesting remarks throughout here that we can comment on. And again, after this, I'll go through some of the papers that I have to respond to some of these claims and the ones made in the previous video.
Evidence, but then you'd expect that with a 45-minute episode. I mean,
it's a little bit soft.
Yeah, a little bit quiet. Maybe your
That's
desktop
just the video.
audio?
Which do provide.
If you turn your desktop audio up, I'm not sure if that'll.
It might. Yeah. It's exactly the same as it. That's the wrong thing. As was for the previous video. Volume mixer. Well, let's see.
Evidential value that there is something.
Does that make any difference?
I don't know that way, but
seems about the same.
Taking place. I also agree that there was a gross under. There wasn't enough of a skeptical voice put into place. I mean, they could have brought on Dr. Gerald Burley, as I mentioned in my review. They could have brought on Susan Blackmore and various other people like that to give both sides. But as Aaron said, I think the main point of this series was to kind of just push the idea that this is something worth considering, and this is why it's worth considering, to maybe bring it out more into the mainstream. Don't know, what do you think, Jen?
Well, a couple things. We all agree that 45 minutes just is not enough time to give this topic, a fair consideration. There is research about people's narratives and the extent to which they change over time.
Good. So this is where I wanted to start. So I think you've already made some claims about that, Nathan. And I wanted to get what she says here about that, because that's one of the things that I wanted to comment on with respect to the evidence that she's citing. So here she's responding partly to what Nathan has said about raising concerns about memory distortion, was one of the points Nathan raised, about near-death experiences over time, as well as some of I think Autumn and Erin have raised issues of lack of the skeptical voice in the documentary. So that's what she's responding to here.
There's an actual study of near-death experiencers' narratives shortly after their near-death episode. And then I think it was like 20 years later, maybe 10 years later, can't remember. And they did text analysis and found no significant difference. So these experiences, and people will say when they're talking about the experience like 10, 20 years later, that it's in my mind as if it happened yesterday. So there's something unique about the way these experiences are fixed in people's memories. But the main point is that this episode didn't get into any of that, and because it treated so topically and left questions for especially people who are thinking really critically. It's just a limitation of the episode. To the question of what difference does it make if someone?
Oh, let's pause it there. So what did you think, Nathan, when she mentioned that study?
Well, I don't know if you saw my big look up to the.
Yeah, I was wondering what was happening there.
Because I remembered, because we'd obviously done the ND Bad Apologetics that morning, and I thought, I've forgotten everything and I've not prepared well enough. So I kind of spent the rest of my time looking at some stuff. And I also remembered that there was that old Pine Creek episode on the NDEs, which I think I'd listened to in the background while I was like doing the dishes or something. And he talks about the Grayson he has Bruce Grayson giving a talk somewhere where he talks about, like this 20-year difference.
So Bruce Grayson is the guy who did the study that she's talking about.
Yeah, yeah. And so I was thinking, hang on, I heard about that. And it's not quite like she's saying it. Like
Do we
it's
want
not
to have a
like,
look at that now?
yeah, I think
I've got it
maybe
up.
now might be the time to take a look.
Yeah,
So,
all
so
right,
I
let's
was
do
like,
that.
I just wanted to clarify it in my mind, because if I was going to come back, I mean, I don't think I did. I don't think there was really the time, because everyone's trying to get their point across on the reviews of the episodes and things. But I was like, I'm sure the way that, you know, she's saying, well, we've got these studies and it shows that memory is like impeccable in these people who have had NDEs and stuff. And I was just thinking, this is a misrepresentation of what that study shows. And I wanted to look for it.
So I've seen other NDEs reference this study as well. When you mention, well, there's much evidence for the unreliability of memory, and that memory is reconstructive, and that it's easy to form false memories and incorporate later details into earlier memories. All of these issues that are very well documented. And so if you say, well, these memories may have been distorted, then they mention this study by Bruce Grayson. The consistency of near-death experience accounts over 2 decades are reports embellished over time. Now, remember how is it Pam or Pan? No,
Pam with
Pam,
a M for
Yeah. So remember how Pam described this. She said that this study interviewed people shortly after their near-death experiences, and then again about 20 years later, and that showed, and they did a narrative analysis, and it showed very little change. That's what she said. Now, it's interesting, and this is not the first time we've seen this. We saw this with Habermas with his reports of that as well. It appears that Pam herself is subject to a memory distortion here. Because that isn't what the study says. Let's have a look at the study. Yeah, so they interviewed a bunch of people.
Oh, do you mean Janice? Sorry, Jan.
Janice.
We've got Jan and Pam. Pam being the case and Janice being
Pam.
the
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got Jan and Pam confused. I'm talking about Janice, what she said. Yeah, Pam Reynolds obviously didn't say anything about this. Yeah. So Janice was talking about their study. And so let's have a look at what it actually says. So it's an interview of 72 patients who had near-death experiences. And they did do a narrative analysis and compared it, and it was fairly similar. But the key point here is when were they interviewed? So let's have a look at this. Mean age of 72 years. The mean number of years elapsed since the near-death experience was 17.7 at the time of the first administration of the scale, and 36.7 at the time of the second. So there was a 20-year gap, roughly, but it's the first interviews were given on average of 17 years later, or 18 years actually. And I think there is total NDE scale. I was just going to say, I think that there's a range here as well, which shows that the nearest one was like 3 years afterwards or something, plus or minus. So that's the standard deviation.
Pam was 3 years after, I think.
Pam Reynolds. Yeah, so her interview was 3 years after the experience. I think that this somewhere here it says what the minimum time was. But anyway, the mean was 17 years. So what this study shows is that once people have had like nearly 2 decades to consolidate their memory, it doesn't change that much in the next 2 decades. I mean, I still have some issues about how that they've done that, because I think they've tested in a fairly abstract way by looking at some pretty abstract notions here. But it doesn't even matter, because we can just take that on face value and say, yeah, it didn't change much. But the point is, it does not substantiate at all what Janice was saying, that the stories don't change much like immediately after the experience occurs compared to reporting them months or years later. This study has nothing to say about that, because it doesn't ask people immediately after the experience. It asks them on average 18 years later. So when I saw that, I couldn't stop laughing, because I was just like, this study doesn't show anything close to what she said it did.
Yeah. And the crazy thing is, you know, like maybe this is me being a bit mean, but like she wants to get the credibility of like being like, you know, I'm a serious researcher on this and I've got these papers and things, but clearly she's not like giving the conclusion that the paper warrants. She's going a step beyond that, and she's got these kind of biases herself, which is like, well, the part of this paper that confirms what I want it to, I'll take that and I'll use it how I want, but I'm not just going to report what the paper itself includes. Maybe it could be a bit more charitable and just say, you know, she's not familiarized herself with this paper in a while, but it's clearly in there. In
my
her
interpretation,
story.
is that it's evidence of what evidence of my point. That she actually I assume that she wasn't lying, that she just misremembered, that she didn't remember that it interviewed people 18 years later on average. And that's a nice little illustration of how our memories distort over time to make our stories more consistent. Anyway, so
I think maybe you can speak to this a bit more, James, as well, because I think some of the research around memory distortions is that they tend to form pretty soon after the event. Like I was looking at some stuff yesterday, about like 9/11 and people who have like weird memories about what they think happened then. But it turns out like would have been impossible from like where they were located to see the things they have. And
Oh yeah, I've read about that as well. I think I might recount some of that in my book. Where is it? I mean, I think everyone watching the stream has seen me pimp out my book several times, but I'll do it anyway. So in my book, in the chapter on the resurrection, I go through and discuss a lot of the research on memory distortions and cognitive biases and other factors, and give a summary of that with specific citations, which I'd recommend if you're interested in this, because I think that this can account for not just a lot of miracle claims, but a lot of near-death experiences and other similar phenomena as well, because people usually report these accounts long after the original experience, and there's plenty of time for distortions there. I did want to share another related study, actually, that I came across.
I guess I was just thinking, though, if it is the case that we have good evidence to think these distortions form pretty early on after the event, as people, you know, go back into a normal conscious state, whether it's like stress or psychedelics or whatever, and start to sort of tell themselves a story about what happened and make sense of it pretty soon after, then that would be good evidence to say that, you know, it doesn't matter what's happening in the next 17 years. Like that key window is like right after Pam's had the NDE to, you know, the next day.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that window is probably on the order of days to weeks to maybe a few months, like a lot less than 3 years. And this is, incidentally, someone mentioned this in the chat, but this is why Habermas and Lacona and others who make a point about, the creed emerged so early, dates to like 5 years or even 3 years after the resurrection. To me, that just doesn't really make much of a difference, because by that time, you still had plenty of time for these false or distorted memories to be consolidated and formed into a narrative. And studies like this, and this is only one study that it's relevant because it's specifically about near-death experiences, but it's using a paradigm to study the elucidation of false memories. And this study is called the know, remember, guess paradigm. Basically, what they do is they show subjects a bunch of stimuli. I think it's words that they use. Yeah, semantically related list of words. And then they ask you to recall those words. And the idea is that there is a what they call an unstudied target word, which is called the lure. So the example they give here is that they'll give you words like thread, pin, and eye, which are related to the concept of, or the word needle. But needle is not actually one of the words that they've given you. So people tend to remember the lure, even though it wasn't one of their presented words, because it's so closely related to them. And this paradigm's been used, you know, in heaps of studies, and they talk about this here. So what they're doing in this study is just seeing if there's any difference in the degree to which people who've experienced near-death experience compared to those who haven't have with respect to forming false memories here. Now, I didn't have time to fully work out. The way they present the results, I find slightly confusing. So they claim that they do find some significant results, but I haven't been able to. So it's this figure, but I can't quite work out exactly what is supposed to be significant here. But anyway, the point I wanted to make was not really, because the sample size isn't huge anyway, so I'm not really sure that I want to hang much on this particular study, other than the point that these false memories are elucidated under experimental conditions. And I think it's like, I don't know, minutes later, and people will form, as it discusses here, very strong memories here. The false memories accompanied with illusory recollection are compelling, since participants are very confident that the critical lure has occurred and are able to give details regarding its presentation, although it was never presented. So basically, it's not just that people will think, oh, maybe it was presented, because they actually distinguish that. That's why it's called, sorry to jump around a bit, that's why it's called the...
It's okay, we've got the highlights.
The remember, know, guess paradigm, right? Because they actually ask participants to say, is this just something that you think might have been presented, or is this something you specifically remember having been presented? So that's the difference between know and remember, right? And so the point is that they get subjects to distinguish between this, and they get people reporting very detailed, specific accounts of, no, I remember the specific stimulus, the lure was presented, and they'll give an explanation for that. And they're very confident that that happened, even though it's an experimental condition, so you know it wasn't presented, and you know the mechanism for that. It's because it's semantically related, so it became activated in your mind, and then it feels like it was experienced. And then, of course, once you sort of think about that, then that reinforces the idea that it was presented, and you confuse your thinking about it with the actual memory of it. So there's a hypothesis here that NDEs are higher on the dissociation scale, which is associated with NDEs. This is the idea of like being outside of your body or external to yourself and things like that, that many NDE experiences report. And there's a hypothesis here that that's high dissociation is linked to different types of cognitive processing, which may be associated with more distortion on these sort of memory tasks. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. This study is too preliminary to really make a definitive judgment. But all I really wanted to show here is that, first of all, I think that this is where the research should be going in terms of studying NDEs. And second of all, that we know that these sort of false memories can be formed even under experimental conditions very soon after, like pretty much immediately after the experience has occurred.
Yeah, it's interesting that the narrative that's coming from the NDEs is, well, naturalists just cannot explain this. They have no explanation. That, you know, all they have is like their dogma and this and that. And it's like, but they're not paying any credence to this sort of thing. Even if it's like preliminary, they should be saying, well, it looks like maybe there's a natural explanation on the horizon, but we don't currently know. No, they just immediately jump to their no explanation supernatural thing. Well, not supernatural, but can't really tell you what it is, but it isn't material. Yeah, it's. Yeah,
so the summary there is that, in my opinion, there's more than ample evidence that these false memories can occur and that memory distortion does occur. We haven't even talked about the fact that you can incorporate things that other people say into your memory. So, for example, this is what I think happened in Pam Reynolds' case, that she recalled vague things. She mentioned this to the doctors, and she says she spoke to the doctors. They told her more specifics. She incorporated that into her memory. I'll talk about that later. But the point is that there's heaps of evidence for all of this stuff. We just looked at one study specific to NDEs there. And the go-to study that the NDEs cite, which is the 20-year gap one, doesn't say anything about this because it's looking at memories formed like 18 years afterwards and how they change over the subsequent 2 decades. So I think that, I mean, I'm almost tempted to just say, well, that's it. I can explain pretty much all of this just by memory distortion. I think there is a lot more to be said, but I just want to emphasize how strong I think that is as an explanatory option for accounting for some of these alleged evidential NDEs, is memory distortion and people incorporating later information into their stories. And really the only way to control for this is to take the accounts immediately or very soon after the procedures occurred. And that's why like the AWARE study that we looked at in the NDE Bad Apologetics, which is run by many NDEers, but I think is still a good study because they are doing this under experimental conditions and interviewing people very soon after the actual operations. And so this is how I think this should be studied. And that's what I said in that episode, and I'll say again, this is the sort of evidence that's persuasive to me. It's when you can control for things like memory distortions and cognitive biases, or at least largely so, by taking the accounts down very soon afterwards so that you have minimal opportunity for these sorts of distortions to occur. And the problem is that these sort of evidentiary accounts just, none of them have been provided under controlled conditions. I think Janice even mentions that in this video at some point, that it's never been reported under controlled conditions. These are all basically case studies or anecdotes.
Yeah, but it's interesting still though that, so looking at Darren, who's like an NDE, but not a researcher in this area, that he takes that one case in the AWARE study as really good evidence of details that couldn't have been recalled, that couldn't have been recalled without the person having left their body. And he sees that as like actually, you know, the white swan sort of thing. Sorry, the black swan against the white swan sort of thing, because you know, like we looked into this on the Bad Apologetic stream, and you brought it up where it's like you know, he's wearing blue and he's bald or whatever, and we can offer a few explanations as to why he might have, you know, put that together after the fact, maybe in recalling this memory, or how he might have come to know that through other means. But for them, that sort of thing, that sort of detail is like, you know, they've seen 11/11. It's been confirmed. There's no way he could have known that that guy was wearing blue and bald and a bit chubby or whatever, unless he'd left his body. And we actually do have this veridical detail. Whereas it's interesting though, because Janice did say, you know, no, we don't actually have any cases of the veridical perception out of body. But it's difficult because you're dealing with like the human level of wanting this thing to be true at the same time, and like that affects the way that we come to evaluate the evidence and like think of how we explain it and everything like that.
Yeah. So on that point, let's see what Janice has to say about the importance of NDEs and why. Because for people like Habermas, it's pretty obvious. They're trying to use this as an argument for ultimately the existence of God or the resurrection of Jesus. Janice, I don't think, has any such interest. So let's see why she thinks this matters. Now we've got to share this again. Eventually I'll get it right. Seeking I. Okay.
Has a conversion.
I'll just jump back slightly.
What difference does it make if someone has a conversion experience, or what implications do NDEs have?
That was Erin's question, I think.
There's what people are saying who've had conversion experiences is that they perceive that how they looked at the world, which is how many people in Western culture look at the world, was limited and to that extent incorrect, and that they have something like a broader perspective, and they're trying to help other people not make the same sort of mistake that they made of drinking the Kool-Aid of Western materialist philosophy as the be-all and end-all of phenomena. So that's what the purpose is, and that many near-death experiencers come back with the conviction that our lives have purpose, that we're existing in this material world to advance spiritually, and that absolutely they know from experience that consciousness is not limited to the function of the brain. And so, but the real ultimate implication is about the importance of advancing in our capacity to love and acquiring knowledge, and that if it were widely accepted that near-death experiences are what they appear to be, then the message of them also takes on more weight and has the potential to influence culture in a positive way by influencing each of us in a positive way. So, but again, the bottom line for our purpose here is that none of this could be gotten into in 45 minutes. And so
Right. So that well, Nathan, you were there. What did you think after that little whatever that was?
Yeah, and I find it really ironic how she's like, drinking the Kool-Aid when it's specifically, people like literally that turn of phrase comes from people drinking Kool-Aid because of the kind of like wacky belief formation epistemology that she's kind of promoting. And she also mentioned earlier, I don't know if it's earlier or later, that like people who adhere to this Western materialist philosophy compared to like flat earthers in the NDE world because it's just so well attested and the natural explanations are so bad. I just found this really bizarre that like so from where she's standing, the purpose of life is to debunk Western materialist philosophy. It's not even clear what she means by that, because it seems like whatever her explanation is, and I kind of tried to press her on that and she didn't give me anything, but she wants that also included in the natural. And so then, surely it would just be this other part of physics that we can study and learn about and maybe make some equations about and figure out and make predictions based off of.
Well, that's what Darren said. I'm not sure if she would agree with that.
Okay.
So Darren said, now I've forgotten whether we already played that or it comes later, but he says that, I think it's later, whatever NDEs turn out to be would have to be part of the natural world because it would be just a different part of nature. Yeah, which doesn't make any sense to me because everything else that he says seems to be arguing against naturalism or materialism.
Yeah. Maybe I'm addressing both positions sort of mushed in.
Yeah, well, and they, I don't think they ever really disagreed with each other, so they sort of tacitly at least seem to support what they said. But just talking about what Janice was saying here, to me, this was just a confusion of a whole lot of different ideas that are barely related to each other. It's just very hard to know how to unpack that. So she mentioned, so she's trying to poison the world by talking about drinking the Kool-Aid of Western materialist philosophy without explaining what any of that's supposed to mean, as if most Westerners even have a clue about materialist philosophy or could care less about it. In fact, I think if you ask most people, that is Westerners, will say that they believe that there's either a God or a spirit or something beyond the material. So I don't even think most Westerners are like materialists or naturalists in that sense, even in a vague way. And now maybe she's responding to the prevailing naturalistic focus in academia, like psychology and neuroscience and medicine. Although she didn't say that, and if she was, then I'd argue, what exactly do you think these sort of, I don't know, non-naturalist or spiritual or whatever approaches add to that? She might have something to say to that. I don't know, but it doesn't just follow that because she wants something more than materialism, that therefore there's anything actually to be added to these disciplines by that. Anyway, so there's that aspect, which is really not well defined. And then she goes on to talk about how people who've had near-death experiences have been positively influenced by that, but doesn't really explain how or why. I think maybe she mentions it a little bit elsewhere in her remarks, but it's still pretty unclear what the positive effect is supposed to be. And she infers that this could have a positive effect on culture if more people came to agree with or know of or experience this themselves, but doesn't really explain how or why. She mentioned something vague about, like, what was it? Promoting harmony or knowledge gathering or something. I don't even remember what she said.
She said something. Love. I remember love.
Yeah, that was there as well. But like, what does any of that have to do with near-death experiences? I know people experience things vaguely like that when they have an NDE, but what does that mean about the person? Like, how does it change the person? Do we have evidence
or how they behave afterwards?
Yeah, NDEs are, more loving or more caring or give more to charity or more pro-social. Like, that would be interesting if that were the case. But it's just this vague inference that, well, people experience these things and it's good, or like they like it, therefore we should have more of this and that would be good. Like, there's no rigor or really clear justification for how these things fit together. And no link to how that relates to, the Kool-Aid of Western materialism. So there's just a whole hodgepodge of ideas thrown in there that are not linked together in a coherent way. And so I'm still left asking the question from her point of view, like not from the Christian apologist, but from, her point of view as an NDE researcher, why should we even care about this? What does it actually tell us about the world? What can we learn about the world that is useful in a scientific or social or philosophical sense? Because it all just seems to be extremely vague. I don't like materialism, and that's what it, and love is good. Like that, like what is it that's more substantive than that?
Yeah,
that was her opportunity to articulate it, and she did a terrible job. Like I can't even make sense of what she was trying to say.
I think it was a great question from Erin as well, because with the Christian, it's like, well, because you're going to go to hell, of course, and yeah, but with her, because she's not yet, she's not fleshed out her theology yet to include heaven and hell, so. She sort of doesn't have the carrot, the big carrot and stick to motivate people to sort of join the in-group.
Yeah, I mean, I know there are other people who make claims about what NDEs can do for people, but at least what she said here was just really disappointing. And I think, see, the thing is, someone who basically agrees with her probably will, because her comments there are a bit like a Rorschach test, right? You can get out of them whatever you like because they're just so vague and fuzzy. So they could be like, yeah, I agree with that. And then you ask them what they agree with and they'll say something, totally different, right? So it's just fluff like that annoys me because it's makes it sound like they're claiming something or they're saying something meaningful, but actually if you break it down, they haven't really said anything. So you can't evaluate that sort of claim when it's just waffle. Anyway, so that was her response to that question. Now, let's see what else we want to talk to. I keep seeing the seeking eye as the first part of the video. I'm like, no, that's not right. That's weird, but no, that is right.
I found that because I was trying to find the titles of the of some of the past videos, like the Whirly one, but because it says seeking eye at the start of the title, like it got clipped off by the amount of text that YouTube has in the thingy. Just a note, if Darren ever watches that, probably change that.
I thought, they did fine introducing some ideas. And I will say too, though, that the possible reason that they didn't bring in the skeptical point of view is that most people who have looked at all the evidence and really know the research
here we go.
well have concluded that NDEs are what they appear. They're not just a subjective experience, but something legitimate. And so it would be, I wonder if it wouldn't be like if you're having a program about the Earth to bring on the people who believe that the Earth is flat. Do you really want to, if you only have 45 minutes, do you want to spend your time listening to a perspective that is held by an extremely small minority of people and contradicts all the evidence.
I'm not sure if you can really draw the comparison between the flat.
Look how just look how smug she is with herself after saying that as well. Like,
mainstream sciences that things don't take place. So it is actually the majority position. Although certainly, as you say, this consensus relies on the fact that a lot of the mainstream scientists, the vast majority of them, has never even studied this. Never even looked to study this subject.
Props to Darren for pushing back on her about that as well.
Yeah, I was going to say that as well.
To come to that conclusion, but I think because the majority of the planet, or at least the scientific background of the planet, do agree that this.
She's enjoying this. Look at that smirk there.
They should have maybe at least had a few skeptical opinions on it. That's what I think.
That point.
I do find it interesting that throughout the series, and then even.
Yeah, let's comment about that. So,
well, she doesn't seem particularly loving. It seems like a very like, like when you watch, when you learn about like chimp behaviors, like the Jane Goodall type studies and things, like the idea of like being in like a social scenario where someone's like constrained by particular rules and things, and to get like a shot in and feel smug about it, like seems like a particularly like primal ape-like thing to do, rather than like this, transcendent. I've been to the spirit realm and the gods have told me what love is.
Yeah, it doesn't really come across that way, I have to say. But also, so apart from the flat Earth comparison, which is just bizarre, I couldn't believe when I heard that the first time. She said that, let's see, the vast majority of people who've really studied NDEs come to the conclusion that NDEs are what they appear to be. Well, first of all,
yeah.
What do they appear to be? Like, I don't. What does that mean? They're an experience that people have. Anything above that is an interpretation that you're layering on that. So yeah. I don't even know what that comment is trying to say. Maybe
I agree they're what they appear to be. Yeah.
I mean, what's the philosophy that you're appealing to there? Like just a naive correspondence theory? Like whatever we experience is just like directly corresponds to the way something is. I mean, no one accepts that because it's ridiculous, right? The example you give, Nathan.
John Searle will get you.
If you see the pencil is bent because of the refraction of light, then therefore it is bent. Like that's a classic example of where that fails, right? We know that fails in lots of, even people who are empiricists, and I think of myself as an empiricist, don't make a naive argument like that. Everything is just what it appears to be straightforwardly. I'm sure she wouldn't agree with that. But if she doesn't agree with that, then what is she saying here? What do they appear to be, and how can we infer about what they are actually like? It's just a bizarre statement. Also, then she says that they're not just subjective experiences. Okay, fine. But I think she used the word, there's something more, plus I had the word. What's the word she uses? There's something more valid, or it wasn't valid.
Attested, did she use? Or
No. Oh, I've forgotten now.
I can't remember. Yeah, I'm going to need more triggers to, it's gone.
Yeah, I've forgotten. But whatever the word she used, it wasn't appropriate to the context. It just didn't make any sense. Like the question is, how do we understand or interpret NDEs, and what evidence is there for the different interpretations, and what conclusions can we draw from those interpretations? That's what's in question here. To say that, they are what they appear to be, and there's something, valid about the experience is just question begging, really, or it's either question begging or it doesn't say it, it's meaningless. Like, well, what is it that they appear to be? I would say that they appear to be a combination of anesthesia awareness plus memory distortions plus maybe some other things going on to do with drugs or low oxygen states and other things as well. That's what they would appear to be to me on the surface of it. You probably dig deeper, there's probably more things going on. But then she wants to say that they appear to be something else. Well, but then what is it that they appear to be? And later when she's asked this, she doesn't have an answer to give. So that raises further questions. If she thinks that near-death experiences are what they appear to be, but can't answer what it is that they appear to be, then there seems to be a contradiction here. All she can say is that there's sort of something beyond what we can currently explain about them, and sort of leaves it vague there, which I find totally unsatisfactory.
It seems like she sort of wants to have a cake and eat it too in that regard, because she wants to say there's something beyond. But then when the naturalist is saying, "Well, I'm a naturalist. I don't have a full explanation, but I'm going to sure as hell try and explain it through science." She's like, "I don't want to participate in that project because I know what it is." But then it's like, "Well, what is it? I don't know what it is, and I'm trying to do so." Like, yeah,
exactly. I know what it is because it's clear. It is what it seems to be, and they're like, "Oh, what does it seem to be?" And it's like, "Oh, I don't know, but it's not this."
Yeah,
it's just a flat-out contradiction.
Well, shall we try and find what part of the brain might be causing this? Well, no, because all naturalist attempts have failed. It's like, yeah. It just,
really, and the flat earth example, maybe I should say why that's a bad example. So, I mean, oh, it's hard to take this seriously enough to explain it. So sometimes people do make the argument that if we're going to base our beliefs on what the consensus of experts on that in that field is, then we should take parapsychology seriously, or whatever it is. Near-death studies is often thought of as a subdiscipline of that. So how to respond to that argument? Well, there's a few points here. One is that we don't just listen to what experts say, we also look at the methods that they use. And you want to see that a discipline is using methods that we would broadly call sound epistemological methods, or maybe you'd say the scientific method, although I don't think there's one, but if you want to be crude, you could say, are they using the scientific method, or just are they using good methodologies, controls and looking for appropriate evidence, considering counter explanations, things like that. And what I would say is that some parapsychological work does do that. I just mentioned the AWARE study before, which I think is good research, but a lot of it doesn't, especially when basically what we're doing is collecting anecdotes or case reports and then dramatically over-interpreting them. That's not good research. I mean, that's a part of research, but the claims they're making on the basis of it go well beyond anything that could be supported. That would be like if what doctors did is just accumulate case reports of all sorts of different diseases and then just publish their speculative opinions about what the case reports mean without any further analysis or study or conducting models or experiments or anything like that. So one point here is that you don't just look at what the experts say, you look at what methodologies and techniques and reasoning the discipline in question is using. And when it's using such clearly unsatisfactory or inappropriate techniques as parapsychology and here NDE research specifically often does, then I'm going to discount that. Another point to be made is that you want to see if the discipline fits within the broader knowledge that we have. So if you take the example of the Earth, it's unclear exactly what discipline that fits in, maybe geophysics or geography or whatever exactly. But all of those disciplines fit within the broader context of our scientific knowledge, and there's no gross contradictions there. There are always residual puzzles that we can't resolve at any given time, but there's no gross contradictions or things that just completely fit, don't seem to have any place in our broader scientific understanding. And other physicists or geologists or whoever else accept experts in those subdisciplines as fitting into the broader discipline. Now, that's not the case for parapsychology. Other psychologists don't really readily accept it as part of the broader discipline, and largely because it makes claims, or it often makes claims that are completely inconsistent with the rest of science. And it's sort of either you accept parapsychology or you throw out, or you accept the rest of science. You sort of can't have both, at least for many of the claims that they make. So there's an issue with sort of consistency and fit with other disciplines. So I think if you look at these points on the basis of consistency with other disciplines and on the basis of the types of evidence and inference used, parapsychology just doesn't score very well, at least large aspects of it. And that's why I think even if most parapsychologists say that NDEs are real, whatever that means, then we don't have to take that seriously. Now, I would say one thing, that near-death experience researchers are probably going to be pretty good at telling you about the phenomenology of near-death experiences, like what they are like and what people report. So I think it's appropriate to rely on them for that. Just like if you want to know what people think about God, you can ask theologians. But you don't go to theologians to find out if God exists, because that's not really what they specialize in, and there's questions about their methodology and so forth. But if you want to ask what's God like, you might ask theologians, at least within a given tradition. Just like if you want to ask, well, what are NDEs like, or what do people report, you might go to NDE researchers. But not if you want to know what their nature is, for the reasons that I've just said. So anyway, that's for those who might be wondering, why is it that there's a difference there? I think there is a clear disanalogy between the flat earthers and the mainstream scientific community who doesn't accept NDEs as being anything outside of the activity of the brain. Anyway, that's probably much more than that point warranted. Anything you wanted to add to that, Nathan?
Just that, I think that's a great way of explaining it, and that for the analogy to work, it would have to be, these materialists are rejecting the phenomenology. They're saying that people aren't having these experiences, which would be like shady and wrong, and would clearly show, I'm so biased because these things, like I don't predict these in my worldview, so I'm just going to ignore the evidence that people have these experiences. Well, then that would be like flat earthers when the NDE researchers say, well, here's a bunch of people having these experiences. But I think it's when we distinguish on, the explanations being offered, well, the NDE researchers on the relevant authority for offering an explanation here for what's going on.
The analogy would be that the scientific establishment is covering up evidence of NDEs and says that everyone who reports an NDE is a liar or is paid off by big whoever. That's where the analogy would be, and obviously that's not actually the case. Anyway, so I mean, I think that was a very revealing remark there. Let's keep going, because I think there's a few more bits that I wanted to pick out before they move on.
On my own research outside of the series, like that there seems to be a little bit of an underlying presupposition that if you looked at the evidence, you would be convinced. And so just personally coming from me, like I don't think it was said in this series, but I've looked up some, I did some further research on some of the people that were represented in the series. And I did hear that kind of rhetoric come up quite a bit. And I found that kind of interesting because like I spent quite a good chunk of my life, a full probably year investigating this stuff. And we talked about this before about some of my own experiences that I've had. And I still came away unconvinced after those. So I think that is the downfall of not having the skeptical voice, is that you have the people who are believing and are completely convinced to the point where they would claim knowledge on it, speaking for the skeptics, and making it their point that if you looked at the research, then you would be convinced. So it kind of, it does give a message that people who don't believe have not looked into it.
Yeah, and I certainly know that is not the case, but I can say that most people who look at all the evidence come to this conclusion, but not all. Absolutely right.
I mean, you can't say that, everybody, all these researchers say that if you really look into this research, you certainly will believe, because Dr. Gerald Verley is a very, very well-known critic of this, and he has done his complete due diligence on looking at the Pam Reynolds case. Many people say he has a point, but the majority of the researchers that have also studied this case say that he's misrepresenting the facts, and that's often the case for skeptical people like Keith Olgussian as well is a known one, and other people like that. And I wish they'd have brought in someone like Titus Rivers, because he wrote the book The Self Does Not Die, and taking the Pam Reynolds case for example, there was no mention of the fact that the researchers have been in and they've seen the medical records for that case. They've spoken to the head surgeons and everybody involved, all who say the same thing. And I think, for example, Dr. Gerald Verley's assertion is that these experiences didn't take place while the brain was not working, and it took place at this point rather than that point. But then on bringing up because this is what I do, I hear an argument against something, so then I put that forward to other researchers. I know, Jan, you know this, and I'm sorry, but I put it to other researchers to get their opinion. And one of them came back with me and said, right, here's the specific medical record of the procedure of the Pam Reynolds case. This is not true. This is not true because this is the actual medical record. And I wish they'd have got into, as I say, I wish they'd have got Titus Rivers to explain how these anecdotes, which start certainly as anecdotal evidence, are taken and then investigated and confirmed by medical records and third-party verification of events and things like that. But as we say, with 45 minutes, I would have taken out a lot of the group session things and the IANS things, although it's important to represent IANS, but I would have taken a good chunk of that away because they're not evidential, they're only sharing stories, and I would have put these points in instead.
Yeah.
Let's pause that there.
Before everyone jumps in at the same time.
Yeah, I can pause them, so I've got the power here. Let's see. So Darren said a few things there. One thing that he commented on was that, yes, these things start as anecdotes, but they can then be investigated and verified. Now, to some extent, that's true. Of course, you can do some investigation and see if external evidence backs up the claim being made. But one problem is that can't account for memory distortion about what the original experience was, as we'll talk about later. I think that's critical in the Pam Reynolds case. But I guess a broader point that encompasses that is that a key limitation of anecdotes or case studies like this is that they don't occur under controlled conditions. That's why we do experiments, in order to try to rule out as many confounding or possible confounds as possible. And Darren just seems to ignore this point by saying, well, yeah, but we can investigate and see if it lines up. Well, but you can never through post hoc investigation rule out all of the various confounds. And I think one of the main ones here would be memory biases and distortions. So I think that this response there is not really adequate. And he complains about some critics misrepresenting the facts. I really don't like that statement because often there is a disagreement about how to interpret the facts or which facts are relevant. And then people will summarize the people who disagree with them by saying they misrepresent the facts, whereas perhaps they just disagree with them on how to interpret them or which facts are most important. And I certainly don't agree that all NDE researchers correctly represent the facts either. So I regard those as kind of cheap shots unless you're going to go through specifics, which I don't care to do with respect to those researchers because I don't necessarily agree with them about everything. But yeah, so I guess the point is, let's stay focused on the actual evidence and how to interpret it rather than complaining about what people misrepresent the facts or whatever they say. Anything else you wanted to respond to, with respect to that comment, Nathan?
Yeah, maybe not particularly on that point. I just think it would be, I mean, I'm planning on when I've got a bit more free time, like obviously looking into some of these things, like Titus Rivis or whatever. But what would be good is if they could make the relevant parts of those surgeons' reports publicly available.
Oh, yes.
Did you? Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the other thing I wanted to comment on. Yeah. So I've not been able to find that. I'm pretty sure it's not made public. I don't even know if it can be made public by the nature of it being a medical record, although I don't know the specific laws there, but I suspect there may be issues there. Now, I have been able to piece together what I think happened at a fairly precise level of detail based on published accounts of the general procedure that's used, which is different to obviously that specific procedure in that specific case, which you need the surgeon's report for. But I do have relevant papers to cite there. So again, what's frustrating about a comment like that is that Darren is saying, well, some other guy has got access to this document that's not public and showed that these claims are wrong. But that's not something I can check or verify because I don't have access to that source. So I just have to sort of trust the person who's saying that. Whereas that doesn't really get us out of the problem of it's basically just some people are claiming a thing. And basically independent skeptical third parties are not really able to investigate that. So that's really quite a frustrating response when you wanted to make something as transparent and as rigorous as possible. You don't hide a key piece of data. I mean, I'm not saying Darren himself is doing that, but he sort of is when he's appealing to this as critical, but then can't actually present it. And so, yeah, I would say that that's not really satisfactory when you're going to say, actually, one of the best evidence cases, and then we investigate it, and then we can show it's true. Oh, but actually, I can't show you that document because it's not public. That's not good enough, because then I'm just not going to believe that it says what you say it does when you can't actually show it and show line by line how it illustrates what you're trying to say.
Yeah. It's kind of like the golden plates type thing.
Yeah, well, but the golden plates, there are at least witnesses who sign their names to having seen it. I've just heard of these surgeons' reports. I've not.
Well, the
got a lot of
surgeon, we
specifics.
saw the surgeon's quotes in. Well, that's the thing. There's this whole question of what do they kind of benefit from this whole thing in any way, and how does their psychology play into it? But there's all these interviews with them. Yeah, she could have. It is kind of like a toothbrush, the saw, and then all these paparazzi people like, oh no, yeah, yeah, it's a little bit like you've got this eyewitness testimony of the surgeon in this sort of cryptic, vague way that isn't really giving you the necessary relevant details to the procedure performed or whatever, but is giving you the necessary. Yeah, exactly.
We'll talk a bit more about that later. I think there's a little bit more I wanted to show here before getting through these papers.
Oh, go ahead, Autumn. You haven't spoken yet.
I know I've been patiently waiting, but I know everybody has a lot of good things to say. I appreciate that about you, Darren, that you said you take the skeptics' questions and kind of go and ask for further research in those areas. And that's kind of what I felt was missing from the show. Is I feel like as far as evidential value goes, the show it was very poor, like each episode, I would say, because if the evidence was so strong, I don't think they would need to add in these appeal to emotions. Like they're constantly talking negatively about the skeptical point of view. Since we're talking about the first episode, one of the women who had a near-death experience mentioned that she used to be an angry atheist, and now she has hope. So this is like an appeal to emotions. Then we have an appeal to authority. This is a psychologist who is very well researched in this area, and he thinks that the evidence is strong. Where did I have that written down? Yeah, so there's a constant theme of the skeptic turned believer, and the skeptic is either unsupportive or lacking hope, and then they have this additional appeal to authority aspect with the psychiatrist, oh, he's a well-educated psychiatrist, and so this seems to be an argument as an appeal to authority. And
can I just
my question for Jan, because she was talking about that study on the consistency of one's narrative when they have these near-death experiences, is going through my mind in this episode is, because we know that memory is reconstructive, could these stories get more cohesive over time, especially with shared experiences? And my question about the study that you mentioned, where it seems that their narrative was consistent over a long period of time, is, well, long-term memory is repetition. So if I have a story that's really powerful to me and I repeat it to a lot of people in my life and to myself because it was a big influence on me, could that play a factor in the consistency of my narrative? Because we know that long-term memory is repetition.
Yeah, and that's a good possibility. I was really responding to the question about whether when you hear somebody's narrative 3 years later, it seems to discredit the narrative because the time has gone by and we didn't hear it initially. So the point being that people's narratives do seem to be consistent. And there's been plenty of research where, including like Michael Sabom was already mentioned, where the hospital study was done and the person was interviewed shortly after regaining consciousness following a near-death episode in which they lost consciousness, which was all what he was looking at. So I'm not really arguing the point that you made, just only the point that if you hear an account 3 years later, it's likely to be true to the account that was told right after the experience occurred.
So we've talked about this. The study that she cited has nothing whatever to say about that because it only looked at near-death experiences reported years later, on average 18 years. And the Pam Reynolds interview, the interview she did with Sabom was 3 years after the experience she had. And as we'll see, she'd already talked to lots of people about it before then. So Janice here has no evidence for that claim that she's made. And I think that there is, we've just talked about that, lots of evidence against that claim that there's plenty of scope for memory distortions and other biases to creep in here. Well, not creep in, to generate these sort of accounts. Also, I think she engages in equivocation here, really, or perhaps a shift in the goalpost or something, when she talks about, well, other studies have interviewed people just after their experience. Aware was one of these. I think that, I'm not sure if that's the one she was referencing or if it's a different study. But from my point of view, that's not really relevant because those studies, or at least Aware, and as far as I'm aware, the other studies that are under control conditions like that, don't show any of these sort of evidential cases where people report things that they shouldn't have been able to know under those conditions. So the fact that people, we're not saying that the near-death experiences are entirely the product of memory distortion. The argument that I would make is that the things that they couldn't possibly have known through natural means, reports of that arose through the memory distortion. Not the entire experience was the product of memory distortion. So mentioning that it isn't relevant to the Pam Reynolds case because it's not being argued that she didn't have a near-death experience and only thought she did afterwards. It's that she had a near-death experience, but some of the aspects of what she reported, particularly the details of the saw and the song and other things, were potentially incorporated or reinforced later on through information she received after the experience. And again, this is not really a complicated point there. There's a big difference between reporting any near-death experiences and reporting things that you couldn't have known. It's hard to understand how she can just equivocate between those so readily like that.
Yeah, I agree. I think what we're seeing though is something that does go on. Well, with other people, when we've got kind of something that's important to us that we want to kind of make sense of. I think it's just it's like we'll fill in the details about one reported experience from like what we think is true about another experience, and we'll be like, oh, these are both NDEs, so if that's what's being said is happening in this one, then I'm going to apply that model to this other case when the person's only saying, like, I heard a noise or whatever, but then we're going to fill in the details that like their spirit is experiencing from the top corner of the room or something, when they haven't said that. They've just said, and some of the reports, this was interesting in the Surviving Death documentary series, some of the people were saying things like, to describe it in terms of like spatial relations wouldn't be proper or something like so they're saying their experience was nothing like geometric in terms of like three-dimensional space, and yet like the video that's being shown is like of a soul moving around an operating theater, and the NDE is like, we'll infer that that's what's going on. It's like an out-of-body experience, but the person specifically said it wasn't spatial, like they're just having some kind of raw phenomenological like sensory input somehow that's all messed up. But what you can do is you can fill in the details of that with what you think is going on with these other cases. They're both NDEs, and so she's just a bit confused when she says it's not spatial. And
well, it's interesting how that harkens back to what Janice said earlier about, well, near-death experiences are what they appear to be. Well, someone reports having a non-spatial experience like this, so like, well, what does that appear to be like? How do you even try to interpret that in terms of what it means for something outside of us? A lot of these things that she says just don't seem to be well thought out. They just seem to be things that she says that to push back against the skeptic.
Yeah.
Okay,
Just
that's
like
interesting.
when you say that these skeptics are showing very negatively, I'd say that they're not as such. It's their arguments which are just said that they don't work. Because we've studied it.
I would say that they strawmanned skeptics, and like I think there is a power in kind of saying what the skeptic might bring up and then just dismissing it in a certain way. Like
I don't think that's what they're doing. They're saying this is one of the arguments that's come forward and it doesn't work. I don't think that's not
I agree with
strawmanning.
Autumn. As a fellow skeptic, I do feel like they brought up the skeptic argument just enough to say, well, this is what they would say, and then they would write it off. And I think what Autumn is saying there, like there is a rhetorical power to doing that. Like, oh, we brought up the skeptical point, but we're not going to really go into it because that's just so close-minded of them.
What I heard was this is one of the it did say, Bruce Griffin, there are many examples, or there are many physical arguments put forward. Here's a couple of them, and this is why they don't work.
But they didn't bring up any of the questions that I would have asked. They didn't bring up like good skepticism, because I would have had much better questions and I would have liked to see the answer to those.
Yeah, I wrote down lots that they had.
We all actually agree on that.
Yeah, there was a lot of like a skeptic would just say that that this is stupid, and I'm like, I would never say that as a skeptic. I would never call these people stupid or irrational or delusional. I would have come with questions and more curiosity to it than that. So that in my mind was, like Autumn said, like a straw man of what a skeptic would say.
So let me just say that if anyone wants to really examine the neurophysiological arguments that have been put forward for near-death experience and the ways that they are inadequate to explain everything that's been observed in near-death experiences, I would refer you to Bruce Grayson's chapter on explanatory models in the Handbook of Near-Death Experiences. Has anybody read that?
I've read some clips from it, but not the whole
I haven't
thing.
read it, but I've watched some
I would love
videos of his
to read that chapter, and then let's get back together.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
Yeah.
What is the alternative explanation?
Well, it's not. There isn't really. Sorry, Jan. There isn't really a given explanation outside of all we're doing is we're showing that physical explanations that are put forward don't work. We don't know exactly the mechanisms of how it works, but we're saying that none of the physical explanations work. That's the main thing. There's an experience beyond what we can explain, so we shouldn't just jump on a promissory note that physicalism will be able to explain it because it has in the past. So we're not. I don't know of any full theory that's been put forward to explain this because we don't know the mechanisms. We're just saying that the current one isn't sufficient, so it needs to be modified.
How can you say there is no natural explanation if there isn't an alternative explanation sufficient for the effect?
No current physical explanation. I don't say
no current natural explanation.
Physical. If there is a natural if there is an explanation, it will be natural because if something exists, it exists as part of nature. It's just a part of nature we don't understand yet, and none of the current models of nature are complete enough to explain this data.
And Nathan, I did hear you refer to panentheism and substance dualism, and different near-death researchers have, in some of their publications, offered those kinds of models as alternatives. But there isn't one alternative model that everybody agrees on. So it is addressed in the literature, here and there by different researchers.
But for yourself, what is the alternative explanation you would be going with?
What I believe from what I know from between studying near-death experiences and my own experiences is that consciousness exceeds the capacity of the human brain and the normal sensory processes and the capacity to reason and predict and so forth. So how that happens, I haven't committed to any philosophical perspective. Would
this just be human animals or would it be non-human animals?
All right, I'm going to stop it there because although Autumn's question is a good one, I think that it's a sort of a tangential issue.
I wanted to keep pushing on that point, and I was a bit,
because the problem with questions like that is because it's just easy to say, oh, I don't know, which is basically what they said. But your question was getting at the crux of it. So this was a very revealing exchange. First of all, they were talking about how skeptics were strawmanned here, and Dan was saying, well, no, they're saying their arguments don't work. Okay, fine. That's his opinion. But then what he was saying is that what we can say is that none of the so a chapter was mentioned by Janice before they got to that point of the Handbook of Near-Death Experiences. So
was that the nine categories or whatever, or was that a different
I don't
book?
think so. Actually, let me just double check that I've not confused myself. No. Yeah, because
I've confused myself. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I have, because I've read the 9 Reasons one. That's not the one she's referring to. This is a chapter in a book called The Handbook of Near-Death Experiences, and I think Habermas also refers to this, and I wanted to get a copy of it, so I looked on Amazon. So for Amazon Australia, it will be different for you in the UK. It's asking for $66.84 for the Kindle version, and if I want to buy a hard copy, it's $71.55. That's Australian, obviously, so prices will be a bit different in the UK or US. But the point is, this is not a cheap book. It's not exactly accessible, is the point I'm making. And I tried to get a copy through my uni library. They don't have it. The only copy I could find in any library in Victoria, the state that I live in, is in the State Library of Victoria, which is like the big library in the city. And that would be like a two-hour trip each way. Well, I can't even do it at the moment because it's in lockdown. But the point is, it's very inconvenient to try to get access to this specific book. Now, maybe I will do it one day just to read this chapter. But the point I want to make here is, if this is like the knockdown argument, it's like the killer chapter that really makes the case here. You could have, like, they made it very inaccessible. Like, why not put this on a blog somewhere or publish it in an actual journal so that it's more accessible? Like, it's an example of, I mean, this is publicly accessible, but it's not very accessible. How many people are going to be able to afford to buy a book like that just to read this particular chapter? So it's very frustrating for me when it's extremely hard to check up on things like that.
Yeah. I was just looking, it's £32 in the UK, so a bit cheaper for some weird
that's about the same price, because a pound is about $2 from what I recall.
Oh, is it? Is it that good? I thought we were like almost at like 1-to-1 because of Brexit and everything, but there we go.
I believe so. Now I'm just curious now. It's about 1.8. Okay, so not quite close. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, not very accessible. So maybe I'll have a read of that someday and we can do a review of that. But for the moment, I have not yet read that chapter. But what Darren is saying, and Janice agrees with this, is that there's no widely accepted model among NDE researchers or explanation for how NDEs could occur or what's going on here. But the general agreement is that naturalistic models can't explain them. Actually, Darren here distinguished between physical and natural, which is interesting.
Yeah.
So I think he wants to say physicalist models can't explain it. So physicalism is false, but naturalism it just encompasses everything that exists. Now, to my ear, that's not a standard philosophical usage of the term naturalism, which normally would be understood as essentially the same as physicalism or materialism. I guess some researchers, some scholars might make a distinction there. I don't. Generally, a naturalist would be someone who doesn't believe that there's anything beyond the natural world, and that would exclude things like minds outside of brains, for example.
Well, if causal reality is natural reality, right? So we're going to have to say that there's some sort of causation going, like these light beings, high frequency teachers that are telling people about things that are going to happen and, love in their life or whatever that people are experiencing in NDEs. Like, for it to be natural, there's going to have to be some kind of natural process of causation. I don't know, the photons from these light beings are going to have to be able to be measured interacting with this person's sense perceptions somehow, like, for that to be a natural explanation, it can't like violate it. That would be a supernatural. Yeah.
Well, it seems that has to be the case anyway, because of the nature of what's reported here. But I'll get to that. Well, actually, maybe now's the time to talk about that. So the issue here is that they want to say they don't have an alternative explanation. I mean, some NDE researchers do, but in general, they don't. Janice doesn't want to give one. Darren doesn't want to give one. Now, I think there's a problem there, because Darren also wants to say that there's no current physicalist model that can account for near-death experiences. I will generally agree with that, although I think we can do better than he says. But yeah, I agree that we don't know the details. We don't know why only some people experience these sorts of things under anesthesia or in other conditions. And we don't know why they report different things. We don't know the details here, certainly. The question is, what can we infer from that? Now, he wants to infer that, well, actually, he uses the word promissory note, that there's a possibility here we could say, okay, it is naturalistic. It is part of the material world. We don't know what the explanation is yet, but one day we'll come up with it. And that's what I would say. Darren says this is unsatisfactory. He doesn't really say why. He just says it's not good enough. I mean, a promissory note of an explanation is not as good as an actual explanation, obviously. But here's my question, because what we have, it would be there would be one situation if we had a promissory note from naturalism or science or whatever, and a good explanation, or at least an adequate explanation from NDEs. But we don't have that. We've got no explanation from NDEers, and actually not even the promise of an explanation. They don't even want to say that they'll figure it out. Maybe they do say that, but they didn't say that here. They don't say we'll figure it out someday. So they just say, no, we don't have an explanation. On the other hand, we have no explanation from naturalism, according to them, but a promissory note that one day we'll get an explanation. And even Darren admitted that naturalism actually has a good track record of this. Scientific explanations have a good track record of explaining things that previously we didn't understand. So to me, that's actually a good reason to believe that the explanation will be discovered and it will be a material, a natural one. So the point is, if you've got two options, an unknown natural explanation and an unknown non-natural explanation, which do you go for? You don't actually have any explanations. You've just got promises. Well, I'll pick the naturalistic or the materialist promise over the non-materialist promise, because one has a really good track record of delivering explanations for things that previously we didn't understand, whereas the other has no such track record. So why would I go with an unknown non-natural explanation when I can always just go with an unknown natural explanation? So the point is, there's a fundamental. You still there, Nathan? Oh yeah, you just got very still. So I wasn't sure.
No, I'm looking at. I'm trying to
gone.
find on the strawman note. I was trying to see if I could find the specific quote in the Netflix film where like there's some equal to the flat Earth stuff. Well, there's a lot of like weird things said, and I was seeing if I could find one of them that would be.
Yeah, I just got worried that my internet had frozen because he was so still there. So the point here is that there's a fundamental flaw in the logic that's being used here, at least by these two, and I've seen this elsewhere as well. No, I don't want to say every NDE has this flaw in their argument, but I think it's common. The flaw is to say there's no known comprehensive naturalistic explanation. Therefore, we should infer that there cannot be or will never be a naturalistic explanation, and it must be a non-natural or a supernatural or paranormal explanation. The problem with that is that we don't have a supernatural or a paranormal explanation either. There's no explanation in either case. So you just have to go with whichever you sort of have more trust in will eventually deliver an explanation. And I think there's way better reason to put the trust in a scientific naturalistic explanation than there is in a supernaturalistic or paranormal type explanation, because there's no good track record there of delivering predictive, well-evidenced, widely agreed upon explanations for anything. So the fundamental question here is, why should I not just go for and say that, yeah, we don't know, but it's just an unknown naturalistic explanation? Indeed, I'd go further and say, whenever I'm presented with a phenomenon like this, in an NDE account that I can't understand, I'll just say, well, I guess something I thought about the brain or about this instrument or about whatever else must be wrong. I mean, maybe Pam reports experiences while she has a flat EEG. Well, I guess it must be the case that you can have experiences while the EEG is flat. We just didn't know that before, and now we've discovered that. So we'll have to rethink the way we understood EEG and the function of the brain, right? And likewise for anything, for anesthesia or whatever it is, you'll just say, oh, well, we'll have to revise some beliefs we had about this specific thing. How do you get to, we actually need to throw out naturalism as a whole and accept a completely different ontology? I don't actually see how you can get there, because there's always ancillary things that the naturalists can just revise. We can revise our understanding of the brain. We can revise our understanding of anesthesia, of EEG technologies, of anything else. We don't have to throw out naturalism as a whole. And so I think that this is just not addressed as to why we need to, or why we should make this inference that the naturalism must be false, just because current explanatory models fail. Anything you wanted to add to that line, Nathan?
Yeah, I'll just be 1 minute, James, but I can still hear.
Yeah, so I think that that's the fundamental problem with the logic that at least Darren is using here, and I think Janice is implicitly endorsing as well, that it just doesn't follow that there's no good naturalistic explanation, therefore we should accept something beyond the natural. If there was a competing explanation that could be evidenced and make predictions and so forth, then that would start to present a case against the naturalism view, because if you've got a plausible explanation that starts to get traction and then just a promissory note of an explanation that will come at some point, well, then you start to say, well, this other explanation is looking a lot better. But that's not the situation we're in, because they don't have any competing explanation that has any traction or plausibility at all. So that's why I'm saying that there's no reason for the naturalists to really reject any of their beliefs at this point, or reject their belief in naturalism. They may just revise ancillary beliefs like about anesthesia or the brain or EEG or whatever else. So there's a fundamental problem with what Darren's arguing here. Now, in terms of what Janice says, she says that she doesn't have a preferred explanation, which is, I mean, fine. She doesn't have to have one, although I'd ask then, how does she know that naturalism is false? But what she says is that she knows. She actually said she believes, but then revised that and says, no, I know I'm not sure why she felt that was necessary, but she says that she knows that consciousness exceeds the brain or is beyond the brain or something like that, which is basically another way to say that naturalism is false, because I think that the naturalists can't really argue that there's anything to consciousness beyond the brain. I mean, maybe hypothetically you could cook up something, but it's going to be pretty ad hoc by that point. So she knows that naturalism is false and consciousness goes beyond the brain. But the question would be, how does she know that? What evidence or inference has allowed her to make that, to derive that conclusion? And what I would say is it can't be an inference to the best explanation where you weigh up the different explanations and pick the one that's the best, because she doesn't have an explanation that competes with anything. She's has admitted herself she doesn't have one. So that can't be what she's done. Is it some sort of deductive argument that's allowed her to conclude that naturalism must be false? But if so, then what are the premises of this argument, which she never sort of tries to give any such argument? And whatever the premises are, the naturalist can just reject one. Like maybe it's something like, under natural, no one can have a conscious experience while they have a flatline EEG. Pam Reynolds had an experience while under a flatline EEG. Naturalism says that this is impossible, therefore naturalism is false, or something like that, right? But the point is, the naturalist can just always reject the idea that you say you can't have an experience under flatline EEG. They can just say, oh well, it looks like the brain works differently to how I thought, and we misunderstood the way that consciousness works. And that might be important. I mean, I don't think that's true, right? I'm just using this as an example. That might be an important discovery, but what it can't get you to is overthrowing naturalism, because all you're going to do is reject specific things that we thought based on scientific or other results. I don't see how you can ever get a series of premises that's going to be sufficient to show that any naturalistic understanding at all is false. It seems the only sort of things that could get you there is some very generic philosophical type premises, or I don't know, maybe certain results from theoretical physics somehow could show that no physical theory is consistent or something. I don't know, but something like that might be able to get you there. But no, anecdotes like this are ever going to get you there. And if you have lots of them, because the naturalists can just always reject, oh, we must have misunderstood how the anesthesia or how the EEG or how the brainstem works, or whatever it is that we want to revise our knowledge of. So I don't think a deductive argument is going to work. If we rule out deductive arguments and we rule out inference to the best explanation or abductive arguments, I don't think it's an induction, because she's not inferring something based on many repeated she's not making a generalization like that. So the point is, I can't even see what type of argument could possibly work here, because she's not trying to give an alternate explanation and say it's a better explanation. Usually that's what people try to do. They say, my explanation is better, so we should believe it instead of yours. But she doesn't have an explanation, and she doesn't try to give any other argument. So how can she possibly know that the consciousness goes beyond the brain? It seems that actually what she's saying is she knows this from personal experience, not through any type of inference at all, because she did mention that briefly. And I think later on she says that she's not really going to change her mind regardless of what evidence shows, or something to that effect. I think Nathan asked her later. But just from what she says here, it seems that she doesn't know what she claims to know through any sort of inference on basis of evidence, because on what I've argued, it doesn't seem like she can. They're just the types of arguments she could make are not available to her because of the position she has put herself in, and nor does she try to make them. She's there because she just has some experience that she's interpreted in a particular way, and that's how she's chosen to understand things. And if she wants to believe that, then she can, right? But why should that be persuasive in any way to people like me who more skeptical and want some sort of argument and series of inferential steps to explain why we should also accept those conclusions? So, for example, if you're going to say naturalism can't account for these series of cases, this other explanation can account for those cases, therefore we should accept the alternate explanation to naturalism, then okay, that's an argument. Now we look at the specifics. But if that's not even offered, then there's not even an argument on the table. There's no reasoning on the table that's really given. All there is just anomaly hunting. It's like, well, you can't explain that, you can't explain this. Oh, how do you account for that? It's like, well, so what? You have to then make an argument for how that entails the beliefs that you want to advance, and that just is not done here, which is what's really frustrating, because they're saying evidence is on their side, but they're not actually explaining. Just citing cases or specific observations or whatever is not actually in itself evidence. You have to explain how the evidence leads to the conclusion you want.
Yeah, I agree. I found it very, very frustrating engaging with this particular group of ideas, because they just don't seem to care about that point. They want to hold any potential explanation that I'm offering to this incredibly high standard. I'm not allowed to like combine or theorize or whatever because I just don't have an explanation. But then when it comes to their own position, it's like, oh, well, you just get a free pass. And it's like they need to consistently apply that skepticism to their own position, not just to the kind of like if I mention hypoxia or whatever, it's like anathema. It's like like I've just blasphemed, it feels like in the conversation. And yet like then they can cite all these various like studies and things they've found and all the depth of research they've done into why hypoxia isn't a good explanation. But then as soon as like you start mentioning, well, what is the alternative here? Is it like a Platonic soul? Is it a Cartesian soul? Is it like Leibniz's monadism? And it's like, oh, no, we're not doing armchair philosophy. I've got my experience.
Yeah, it's just hard to understand because Darren said this. He's like, none of the naturalistic explanations work, or none of the arguments work. Let's suppose that's true. What follows from that? Well, nothing really if you can't offer any alternative, because none of the alternative explanations work either. So we're just at a situation if we don't know. And again, if we're going to take promissory notes from the bank of supernaturalism or paranormal or whatever, and the bank of naturalism, I'm going to take them from the bank of naturalism any day of the week because it's got a way better track record, a way better credit history, if you like. So, I mean, that in itself is not there's only so far I can go with that argument, but certainly at the level of the promissory note thing that Darren said, well, yes, so I'm definitely going to remain a naturalist if that's all we've got. So how are we supposed to conclude from the failure of all naturalistic explanations that there's more to consciousness than can be explained by the brain? I just don't understand it, and it's just never seems to be articulated. And I think that's the fundamental problem with NDE research. It's not any of the details that they try to bog you down in, even though we will get to that. But it's just the fundamental structure of the argument doesn't really work unless they want to actually present an alternate explanation for NDEs. And then we can assess that explanation, how plausible it is. And I think Nathan and I have talked about this in a couple of episodes now, like substance dualism, dual aspect idealism, and some other related ideas. And I think that there's so many problems with those explanations. They're easily far worse than naturalism, which I think is why most NDEs don't argue for them. Maybe from other reasons as well. They don't like being dogmatic or whatever. But anyway, so the summary of all that is that there's a fundamental problem with the logic that's being used here, or really the lack of the logic about what they're supposed to, how the evidence is supposed to entail the conclusions that they want to push for. So I think at this point, that's probably, I think, all of the video that I wanted to show. I think shortly after this, you move on to more. Oh, yeah, that's right. Janice starts talking about like precognition of people calling home and dogs knowing when their owners are coming, and it just gets really, really silly. So I'm going to do her a favor and not show that because it's later on.
There's one point that might be interesting to watch. I don't know if I can offer a timestamp. You might have, but like where I got a bit annoyed and had a bit of a go at her for claiming that she's part of this like elect group of people.
Yeah, if you want to have a fiddle around to find that, that'd be cool.
Yeah, I'll have a look.
Yeah, cool. So I think then I'll unshare that so we can look at some of these papers. So this is sort of so we've covered sort of looking at some of the ways that NDEers talk about and defend NDE cases, specifically the Pam Reynolds case, some of the considerations around memory and competing explanations and things like that. So now I really want to dig into some of these details of Pam Reynolds and present some of what I found about this. So again, even if the naturalist can't offer an explanation, I don't actually think that the claims of NDEers follow. But at least in the Pam Reynolds case, I do think that the naturalist can offer at least a partial explanation. Now, we can't explain every little detail because we just don't have enough evidence, and there's still things we don't understand. But I think that in broad terms, we can account for what happened to Pam Reynolds and what she accounts by referring to two phenomena, basically a combination of memory distortions and anesthesia awareness. Those two things together, I think, can account for basically everything in the Pam Reynolds case. Now, we don't fully understand either of those phenomena about how memory distortion works or about how anesthesia awareness occurs or why it occurs in some people and not others. So there's certainly a lot of things that we can't fill in the details there. But I think it's still a long way away from where the NDEs are about explaining it because they can't really say anything meaningful about how this works. So that's the basic claim, that we can account for this we can account for the Pam Reynolds case by anesthesia awareness plus memory distortion. So I'm going to try to defend that claim with reference to the specifics that NDE has put forward. So now the challenge is to try to go through this in a sort of logical order. So I think what I'll do is I'll share this account from the original book where this was published, which is what is it? Light and Death by Sabom, whatever his name is. Let me get this right. Application. Where is it? Where is it? Oh, here it is. Okay, here it is. So this is the relevant chapter from that book where they talk about the Pam Reynolds case. So obviously I'm not going to go through everything here. I've got certain passages highlighted that I want to focus on and basically take a claim, and then we'll sort of look at that claim with respect to some studies that I've looked at here. This all happened in, I think it was 1991 when Pam Reynolds had this operation to remove an aneurysm in her brain is the basic idea. And so the procedure that was used is, at the time it was quite new procedure, I think developed by this guy, or at least pioneered by this guy, Robert Spetzler. And it was the sort of lead doctor in the operation there. And the procedure involves essentially cooling the patient down, draining all of the blood from their brain, performing the operation when the brain has no blood in it and is at a very low temperature, and then, slowly raising the temperature back and returning the blood to the brain. And the idea here, or the claim, is that the near-death experience that Pam Reynolds reported occurred during this time when she had, no blood in her brain, or at the very least no activity in her brain, as measured by electroencephalogram. And so that this allegedly rules out any possibility of seeing or hearing the things that she did, through conventional means. So that's the basic background. Now let's look at some specifics here. So here they're talking about standard EEG electrodes taped to her head would record cerebral cortical brain activity. That's a way of tracking how deep she is in anesthesia, essentially. The auditory nerve center located in the brainstem would be tested repeatedly using 100 decibel clicks emitted from small molded speakers inserted into her ears. In response to these clicks, sharp spikes on the electroencephalogram, which could evoke potentials, would assure the surgical team that the brainstem was intact. I'm not 100% sure why that's done, but I understand it's to basically ensure the integrity of the operation and that nothing's going wrong. So the point there is that Pam Reynolds, had these earbuds essentially taped into and stuck into her ears at the time. And also her eyes were covered, which it says somewhere or in here. So the claim is that not only would she have been able to see, even if somehow she was aware, but she wouldn't have been able to hear. And NDEs also point out that it wasn't just that her ears were covered, but they also were playing these 100 decibel clicks from the speakers in her ears, which would have muzzled any external noise. So on that basis, so her she was prepared and so forth. And skipping forward a little bit, so here's what she reports seeing. Hearing. She reports hearing a sound of a saw, which she said looked like an electric toothbrush. So she heard it and saw it. That had a dent in it, a groove at the top where the saw appeared to go into the handle. They had interchangeable blades and so on and so on. And she said it was humming at a high pitch. And then all of a sudden it went brr. And this
Isn't
saw was
that an
used.
incorrect fact, James? The
which one?
groove in the top. The groove in the top of the handle.
Yes, yes, I believe so. I think it's. Oh, I forget exactly. The groove is somewhere different. Now, I think it's easy to account for that. It's just a memory distortion. The thing is, though, that the NDEs will argue that it doesn't matter if she got precise details wrong. She shouldn't really have known what the thing looked like at all.
Yeah.
Because she would not have been able to see it at any point. And so I'll get to that. But yeah, so the way she describes it is not exactly correct as far as I understand. But personally, I don't think that there's, I don't really interpret too much into that. Where was I? So Spelter removed the bone flap from Pam's skull. So he's using this saw to cut open her skull, essentially. She's already under anesthesia at this point, obviously, exposing the outermost membrane of her brain, the dura mater. This is the material that is cut open and so forth. What did I want to say about that? Yes. So at that time, Pam reports hearing someone say that her veins and arteries were very small. She said it was a female voice. And a few other sort of vague comments, tools and instruments she didn't recognize. But that's the main comment that people were appealed to, the fact that Pam reported hearing a female voice talk about her veins and arteries being very small, which is something that was later corroborated, that one of the surgery team did say that at that time. Okay, so then okay, so I think I want to stop there at this point, because these are three of the main evidential observations that are referred to in the Pam Reynolds case. The fact that she could describe what the saw looked like despite not having seen it. she could describe what it sounded like despite not being able to hear it by normal means because she was under anesthesia, plus she had the earbuds in her ear emitting clicks. But also hearing the female voice talking about her arteries being very small. Okay, there's one more evidential part that comes later on at the end of the surgery, but we'll talk about those now. So one of the first things that we need to establish here is whether we can account for those using through anesthesia awareness. So we know that some proportion of people experience awareness during anesthesia, and that is how I believe that Pam Reynolds was able to hear the saw and also hear the person making the comment about her arteries and veins being small. And now, she would not have been able to see the saw because her eyes were taped shut. Now, I don't believe she did see the saw. I believe what happened is that she, after the experience, she talked to the doctors about this. Later on, I'll show you, she says that she talked to the doctors. She told a lot of people about it, actually. And at some point, someone either showed her what this looked like or showed her a picture of it or just told her what it looked like, and she incorporated that into her memory. So I don't believe that Pam Reynolds actually saw the saw. I mean, it doesn't really look like that much anyway. It just looks like a handle with a kind of a blade on it, like Nathan showed us it before. It doesn't look like anything very special. So I believe that she sort of reconstructed that from a combination of what she heard plus what other people said about it. I think that's well within the well within the scope of what memory distortions over 3 years can do. But how do you account for her hearing it and hearing the comment about the arteries? In particular, when her ears had the earbuds in them with the clicks. So one thing we need to establish is the nature of the noise that she had in her ears. So I did some reading into this, and let's see if I can find the right papers to pull up here, because it's important to get the precise parameters here that were used during the surgery so that we can understand whether or not she would have been able to hear anything. Now, because there's like a billion papers here, the same problem occurs that I need to find the right one. So the main point that I'm going to show you when I find the reference is that it's not really clear in the book that I was showing you there, but the way they do it is that they play these very loud clicks in one ear, and the other ear they play soft white noise. And so the hypothesis here is that she was able to hear the things that she heard in the ear that wasn't the one that was being subject to these very loud clicks. So how do I know that they were only that the clicks were only being presented to one ear? Because most NDEs won't report that, but that is actually okay. So that's something different. Here we go. Okay, so here's one. Now we've got to share this. So here's one paper that reports this. Applications. Okay, my snack of PDFs here. So this is actually a pro NDE paper here. It's responding to, Woolley, or how you pronounce his name, who's a skeptic here. But most of the paper is not of great interest. It's just this section here, where, here we go. So this is an account from someone who was I think they call themselves a lead technologist working in this hospital. And they explain how the auditory setup works. So the auditory stimuli in the ipsilateral ear, that means on the same side, was a broad-based frequency spectrum click. So those are the loud clicks that were mentioned. We stimulated a rate of that many per second with a pulse duration of 100 microseconds. The contralateral ear, which is on the other side of the body, was masked with a 40 to 60 decibel white noise. And it then says about the earpieces that were used, which were stuck into the ear. So this is one source that mentions this. There are some other sources as well. So this is from, I think this is the South Australia hospital that actually is talking about this same procedure that's used, basically evoking these responses in the brainstem in response to auditory stimuli as a way to test its activity during an operation. It mentions this as well, that the standard procedure here is to use a click duration of 100 microseconds. The rate varies a little bit. That's slightly different to the one just mentioned. And then they mention wideband masking noise is applied to the contralateral ear at 40 decibels. So that is another example of how that's studied, how that's applied. This is another study, actually a systematic review of this basic procedure being applied in a wide range of cases. This is actually for audiological assessment, so it's a bit broader than just in these sort of operations. And it talks about how this is applied. So here they're mentioning the masking, and that's the thing that's done in the other ear, and the white noise. So you can see that the volume of the white noise varies, but it's generally between like 25, I think, is the lowest, and 60 is the loudest. So 40-ish decibels. So those are a few examples to show that this type of procedure is pretty standard, in which you have one ear where the clicks are delivered, and then the other ear in which you have this white noise. So the clicks are 100 decibels, which is very loud, although it's not a constant noise. It's going on and off, right? And again, the patient's under anesthesia at this time, so normally they're not going to hear this. Now, the question is, how loud is 40-ish decibels? Well, I had this up.
Do you have a decibelometer?
Yeah, well, I've got this little table here. I mean, you can look this up, but I won't actually show it because it's something you can just easily Google. But 40 decibels, so according to this table, a quiet office is something like 50 decibels, whereas a library is like 30 decibels. Conversational speech is usually said to be around 60 decibels. So the point is 40 decibels is pretty quiet. It's not loud. 60 decibels is louder, so that's more conversational speech. But the point I want to make here is that from all the evidence I can find, the noise that was played in Pam Reynolds' other ear was white noise that was very soft. Its purpose is just to raise the threshold so that there's less interference between the two ears. So the purpose is not to blanket out all other noises. So I think that it's perfectly plausible that she was able to hear out of this other ear, because all she's got there is fairly quiet white noise. And what she heard was...
Can't see the table, James, by the way, if you changed yours.
Yeah, I didn't show it just because I don't want to move out of my PDFs. Yeah, I mean, you can Google that yourself. That's not exactly a niche point there. The point is that 40 decibels or even 50 decibels is not that loud. So the claim is sometimes made that Pam Reynolds would never have been able to hear anything because she had this 100 decibel noise in both ears, but that's false. It was only in one ear, periodic clicks. The other ear only had 40 decibel noise. So there is a way she could have heard this. Obviously, I can't prove that she heard it because of that, but the point is it impossible? Is it outside of what you can explain naturalistically? I don't believe so. There just isn't evidence for that. So I believe she was able to hear the saw and possibly a snippet of conversation. Again, I can also attribute that conversational snippet to a memory bias from later on, because, for example, you could say that, for example, she heard a snippet of someone mentioning something about her arteries, and then the person that she's talking to says, "Oh yeah, someone said that your arteries are small," and then she remembers that and repeats that as what she actually experienced. That's just a classic incorporating something that someone said into an earlier memory. So again, I think you can appeal to memory distortions there as well. And I don't know exactly what the combination was. How much did she hear? How much was the distortion? The point I'm making is that there is ample opportunity for her to have heard things in the ear that wasn't subject to these very loud clicks. So that's what I believe happened. I think, could definitely have heard the saw. Someone's also, I think, what is his name? Woolly has raised the point that she may have been able to hear through bone conduction of the sound as well as the saw cut into her skull. And this is a known phenomenon if you look up...
Beethoven. How did Beethoven learn to play the piano? Right?
If you look up the Weber test, which is a hearing test, this relies on the same point about sound being conducted through the skull. So I think that hearing the saw is the easiest thing to account for, because there's multiple ways she could have actually heard this, and because of the nature of the noise, and it would have been fairly loud, I think she could have heard that. The conversational snippet's a little harder, but still, if she was aware at the right time, then I think that it's quite possible she could have heard this through the ear that wasn't subjected to the very loud clicks. So that's how I account for those auditory observations. And as I said, I don't think she actually saw the saw. I think that she incorporated that into her memory after the fact when she mentioned the sound of it, and people said, "Oh yeah, it looks like this," or whatever. Or maybe she'd even seen a picture of it in some documentary. Who knows? Like there's many options there. It's hardly something that's impossible to have come across. Now, I need to address another point, because NDEs, apart from the noise point, they'll also say, but you're forgetting the fact that Pam Reynolds' brain was under burst suppression this whole time, which basically means there's no possibility that she could have been aware. So yeah, anesthesia awareness is real, but it doesn't happen under burst suppression, is the argument, and therefore she can't have been aware enough to hear anything. Okay, well, we need to address that claim as well. Now let me go back to my PDFs here. I think I got out of that one what I wanted to. That's for later. Okay, so the critical question is, when did she go under burst suppression? Let me actually show you what that is before I get into that, actually. This is annoying because I want to show. I'll just have to reshare again. Okay, let me share this. Oh, but which one is it? Yeah, it's that one. Protocol. Okay, so scroll down a little bit. Oh, yes, I accept. Okay, so this is from a paper talking about different EEG patterns, because this issue of awareness in anesthesia is a big issue in anesthesiology, as you might guess. And this paper is talking about this. This BIS score that is shown on the right here is a scale that basically describes the level of consciousness on the basis of EEG patterns. I'll show you a bit more about this later. All I wanted to show you here is sort of what burst suppression is. So when you're normally awake, your EEG looks something like this. It's lots of sort of small spiky activity. And then, when you're asleep, but also when you are sedated, the frequency increases and the amplitude sort of goes up as well. So it sort of gets longer and sort of wavier. And then when you go into full anesthesia, it gets, you know, even more like that. But then when you go even further down under anesthesia and into what's called burst suppression, it changes a bit and looks like this. So there's periods of a flat line interspersed with these periods of bursts of activity. So that's what is referred to as burst suppression. And then even below that is called a flat line, where it's just there's no measurable activity at all. So that's just, I just wanted to show you what that means by burst suppression, because people talk about that here, and that's what Pam Reynolds was under during her procedure, and we'll look at that in a minute. Okay, so the claim would be that you can't have anesthesia awareness under burst suppression. Okay, showed that one. So I've not been able to verify that specific claim because it's kind of hard to test, right? Because you don't want to invoke awareness under anesthesia. You sort of have to wait while it happens. However, there have been studies on this. So let me show you a few of these. I think this one is a really good one. So let's share that. Feel free to jump in at any point, Nathan, if you want to interrupt my...
Yeah, no, so there's just been a discussion on Mary's room and dualism and stuff going on in the chat, which has been...
interesting, but not directly relevant.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, chat always goes off on its own thing. Okay. Yeah. Anesthesia awareness and the bispectral index. So that's the BIS that I showed you on that chart. This is a measure of basically the degree of awareness. And it's isn't there another paper that talks about this as well? I feel like I'm missing a paper here.
There was
anyway,
one you brought up this wasn't the one in the bad apologetic stream, was it?
No, these are different ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I showed other papers there as well where where researchers are talking about awareness during anesthesia. There's lots of cases of this. Is this the one that? Yeah, this is one I think it is. Okay, this is a really cool study because this is an experimental study assessing about 1,000 patients using two different monitoring techniques, BIS and this other one. I'm not exactly sure what this other one is. But the interesting thing about BIS is that it kind of it's not the same thing as whether a person is under burst suppression, but it's closely related to that because the BIS score is calculated from the EEG in a complicated way. And basically, the lower the score, the more sedated or the more, I guess, comatose that the person is, the less brain activity there is. And what they were doing in this study is just looking at whether these two techniques could be more effective ways of preventing anesthesia awareness. So what they found, and again, because this is an experimental study, I think it's able to remove a lot of the confounds that subject to that sort of case study reports are subject to. So anyway, what I wanted to show you is that of the, let's see. So they actually did 3 interviews with all of the patients at different times with different people. And it's interesting that many of the patients reported memories only in some of the interviews, but not in other ones, which to me is already quite interesting because you'd think if you had awareness during an operation, you would kind of remember that and report it, you know, on all occasions, or, you know, if you don't remember it, you wouldn't report it. But most of the patients, or at least a bunch of the patients, reported on some of the interviews, but not on others. So I'm wondering whether there's some weird memory things going on here, but they don't really assess that. That's not directly part of the study, but I just thought that was interesting. So here it says 2 of these patients reported memories in all 3 interviews, 1 reported memories at only the last 2, and 1 reported memories at only the 3rd interview. 5 other patients had possible awareness, but their reports are a bit more equivocal. So there's a small number here. I think it's about 10 who, sorry, 9 patients who reported some degree or possible awareness. Actually, they have 16 in this table. Anyway, but the point is, out of 1,000, it's a small number. So the point I want to make about that is that anesthesia awareness is rare. It's not like it's a common thing. But the point is, Pam Reynolds' case is rare as well. So it's not like there's a surprise that we're going to have to appeal to some rare phenomenon to explain it. And actually, any account has to deal with that. So whatever explanation you want to give, if there's some immaterial soul or whatever that's giving rise to NDEs, I mean, most of the time it doesn't do that either. So like whatever the explanation is, NDEs reports like this are rare. Anyway, so let's look at some of these cases. One of the great things about this study is, and you can see this here, we actually have not the EEG itself, but we have the BIS score and the MAC score. But I'm going to focus on the BIS one here over the course of the procedure, which is way more than we have for Pam Reynolds. Plus, we have this bar here, which shows the likely period of awareness based on what the patient reports. So again, this is far better evidence than we have for Pam Reynolds, where this is all by inference and we don't have this information. I mean, I don't know if it's in the surgeon's report. Maybe it is, but at least I've never found it anywhere. So these are the two patients. Is it these two? Yeah. These are the two patients who had the most unequivocal awareness experiences. What I wanted to show you here is just, first of all, that this does happen. This S here, what does the S stand for? The S is, I think, the induction of... Oh, blast, I highlighted it somewhere. Where does it say what the S is? Yeah. A is the induction of anesthesia, S is the surgical incision, and I is intubation. There you go. So the induction of anesthesia happens at the A here, and then this bar is where they're likely to have been aware. Again, based on 3 interviews that occurred shortly afterwards, so much higher quality evidence than we have for Pam Reynolds. And this 40 to 60 here is generally where you want to keep the EEG for most types of anesthesia. Now, as we just saw before, burst suppression occurs lower. That's more like, I think, the 20 to 30 range. So what they're aiming for in this study is a little bit different. They're not going all the way down to burst suppression. But you can see that this patient here had awareness when her BIS score was around 30 to 40. Now, that's probably higher than Pam Reynolds would have been if she was under burst suppression, but not dramatically higher. And you see that it varies quite a lot from different patients. This patient's was a fair bit higher, and it fluctuates quite a bit over the course of the study. Of the experiment, of the procedure. And these are other patients here that had other degrees of awareness as well for different various of times. You see patient 8 here actually had a very long awareness period, and for times, for a few minutes, went down to very low BIS score levels, and this patient as well. Indeed, at the point of awareness here, the score gets very low. So the point to be made here is that, and here's another example, although this one, actually, I want to show you this because this one here is when I think a similar type of procedure was occurred, where the patient went to flatline, or possibly burst suppression flatline, not exactly sure, but you see it went way down. And there, no awareness was reported, but there was awareness before that. So the point I wanted to make with showing you that is that this phenomenon of anesthesia awareness is well studied. It's not understood in detail, but it certainly occurs. And people can report awareness even with very low BIS scores, which corresponds to very, not actually flatline, but at least getting close down to that. Now, I can't tell directly whether these people were under burst suppression at any point, other than that the BIS scores were at some points pretty close to, if not at, what the BIS scores that you can get during burst suppression. And we don't know exactly what Pam's score was. Indeed, I don't know if this measure was even available at that time, so I don't know if that was even recorded. So the point I want to make here is that I don't think it's established that awareness under anesthesia is impossible under burst suppression. It's probably unlikely, but I don't think it's at all established to be impossible. And even if Pam was being held generally at burst suppression, there's still the possibility that for short periods her brain activity went a bit above that, as you see in these charts here, where there's quite a lot of variation over the course of the surgery. And it would be during those periods of slightly higher brain activity, still under anesthesia, but slightly higher brain activity, when she could have reported awareness. So that's what I think happened here, that Pam Reynolds, either while under burst suppression or just while her brain activity was slightly elevated above burst suppression, could have experienced anesthesia awareness. But there's even more to it than that, because burst suppression is it's a very low level of activity, as you can see in the patient 9 here, where they were initially anesthetized and then only later went down to the flatline level when the cardiopulmonary bypass part of the surgery was conducted. That similar thing happened with Pam Reynolds as well. So now I want to show you. Why did I stop sharing? It's also a PDF. Now I want to show you some reports from. Sorry, got muddled again here. From the guy who actually did the operation. Okay, so this is Robert Spetzler. This is that doctor that we mentioned before. This is a paper that he published just a couple of years before operating on Pam, where he talks about the procedure essentially. And the point that I want to, oh yeah, this is the other source I was getting. This is talking about the sounds that were provided again to the ears. He mentions here that the contralateral ear was masked to prevent bone-conducted acoustic crossover. He doesn't say what the decibel level though was. Anyway, but what I wanted to show here was actually not that. Sorry, it was a different paper, also by Spetzer, but this is a more recent one where he also describes this procedure. And here we go. He's describing the technique here of the procedure. And he says here, once the dura mater is opened, barbiturates are given and titrated until EEG burst suppression is achieved. And then he starts to talk about the advantages of achieving burst suppression with regard to the success of the operation, which for our purposes are not interesting. But this sentence is critical here. Once the dura mater is opened, the drugs are given until burst suppression is achieved. Now, let's remember, what is that saw for? That saw that Pam Reynolds heard and later described as seeing, but I think she just heard it. Nathan, what was that saw for? Remind us.
I don't know, James.
Well, if we look back at the, now I've got to show people in the chat might, if you're paying attention, remember, because we just read this from the book.
I was too distracted by the chat. That's the
saw thing that she's talking about here, the one that
is that for opening the dura mater?
Yeah, it's for cutting through the skull and exposing the dura mater,
right? Which
is then cut through. So that very saw that she heard about is a saw that's used to get to the point in the procedure after which you the burst suppression is induced.
Yes.
So she was already under anesthesia at that point, but not to the level of burst suppression. You got to think about levels of anesthesia. So I don't even know if it's established that you can't have anesthesia awareness under burst suppression, but whether or not that's true, she was not under burst suppression at that point because that saw is not even used at the point of the operation where you go under burst suppression. And that's from Spetzler's publication himself. Okay, so we have a pretty clear timeline here. Pam goes under anesthesia. Probably that's at a BIS level of 40 to 60, which would be the standard for a general anesthesia. We know that awareness can definitely occur under that level of anesthesia. She experienced some degree of awareness where she hears the sound of the saw in the ear that was only subject to the white noise, and possibly also through bone conduction as well, which we know can occur, and possibly hears a snippet of conversation. And both of these she reports afterwards, and the doctors tell her more about that, and she incorporates some of that into her memory, and so that's where she gets the appearance of the saw from, maybe a bit more detail about the conversation. So that's three of the details accounted for. Note that all of this has occurred before the blood has been drained from her brain and she goes to full flatline. So all that talk about no possibility of activity is irrelevant because all of this occurs well before that. She hasn't even gone into burst suppression at this point. But there's one aspect that we haven't talked about yet, which is the song that she hears at the end of the operation, which was confirmed by people involved in it. So let's look at that now. I just want to make sure I've not... Okay, so I think I've shared what I wanted to with that. Okay, good. So let's go back to the... some people saying my explanation is speculative. Yeah, so... something beyond the natural world that we don't know anything about and can't test is somehow less speculative. When I'm just pointing to known phenomena.
Yeah, I genuinely don't know how serious this person is or whether they're just trolling or whatever.
I don't know, but people will say this is speculative. But I want to ask, how is it more speculative than what the alternative is? Because I'm appealing to known phenomena using published studies that have talked about this. So I just don't see the force of that. Anyway, okay, so I've talked about that. We talked about the clicks. Oops, went a bit too far. Okay, so here we're looking at moving forward a bit later in the operation because it takes many hours. The blood's drained from... Hey, what happened there? The blood's drained from her body. The aneurysm was removed. The warming process begins because her temperature's reduced way down as well to allow the tissue to survive longer without oxygen or with minimal oxygen. So Pam goes through more details of her near-death experience here, but there's not really any significant evidential aspects to that, at least that. Yeah, so Pam does report something about experiencing her defibrillation, which I think is relatively less likely. But see, it's also not really very evidential because she would have known that she would be resuscitated like that. But what I wanted to focus on is this part here. So yeah, some people will argue that she experienced some aspect of her resuscitation, but I just don't really see how that's evidentiary. She just basically says like she remembers being like jolted or something, but she would have known that could happen. So I just don't see what's supposed to be there, and it's pretty vague what she says. But coming to this part here, where are we? Why is it in Fahrenheit? That's so annoying. Anyway, so she feels like she has to come back to her body. So at this point, they've reinfused blood into her brain. The bypass machine was turned off, so that was the machine that was basically bypassing her lung. When Pam's temperature had reached a life-standing but still subnormal, 80, basically 90 degrees. Now, someone convert that to Celsius for me because other sources I use have Celsius, like sensible people. Her body was then de-instrumented and her surgical wounds closed. Okay, so she's blood's gone back in her brain. 31? Yeah, okay. I think I've seen 32 in another source, but it's 31, 32. So her temperature's come right back up. I think it was down to 23 Celsius at some point. I think that's in a different source. It's come back up to 31, 32. Her blood's back in her brain.
0.6 is 32 exactly. Sorry, I didn't put the 0.6 on the end.
Okay, there you go. Yeah, so that's probably been converted. So yeah, blood's back in her brain, bypass is off, temperature's up, but not right back to normal levels yet. And it says her body was then de-instrumented and her surgical wounds closed. Why does it keep doing that? Okay, then it says the music in the background began playing rock as Spetzler's younger assistants took over the closing surgical duties. So basically what's happened at this point is the main stuff's been done, and it's just like basically cleaning up and preparing her for recovery. And, the lesser people can do that. So, the younger assistants, as it says, took over here. Then it says she reports the song. When I came back, so she comes back to awareness at this point, they were playing Hotel California, and the line was, "You can check out anytime you like, but never leave." She mentioned this later to Dr. Brown that it was incredibly insensitive, and he told me that I needed to sleep more. When I regained consciousness, I was still on the respirator. I'm not sure if that's then or later on. So again, she's still under anesthesia at this point, and still the point where she hears the song here, and her temperature is still quite low. But again, she's not under, I don't think she's under burst suppression at this point. That part's unclear, but she's definitely got blood back in her brain, and the main part of the operation is over. So again, what I think happened is that she experienced another episode of anesthesia awareness as essentially her BIS score went up, and she had a period of awareness where she heard the song. And later on reported this to the doctor. And it says that she said that there. So she's already talking to the doctors very soon after this happened. And it says here, the surgical report says that she was taken to the recovery room, still intubated, but in a stable condition. So generally what would happen is they're taken to a recovery room, and then at some point after that, they would wake up from the anesthesia. So what we have here, I think, are two instances of anesthesia awareness, one basically before the main part of the operation and one just afterwards. And they would have occurred, definitely the first one, and I also think the second one, although I can't definitively verify that, but based on the explanation that she's been de-instrumented and the main part of the operation is over, the wounds have been closed, I don't see why she would be held under burst suppression at that point. So she's on the move to recovery. I expect she's being held under normal general anesthesia at that point, and so I don't think she's under burst suppression. Again, even if she was, I think it's still possible she could have had an experience, but I suspect that the experiences of awareness occurred at periods before and after the main part of the operation when she was not under burst suppression, and we know that anesthesia awareness can occur. And what she got in the first case was a snippet of the sound of the saw and a snippet of conversation, and afterwards a snippet of music. And later on, as it says here, pretty much like very soon afterwards, she's talking to the doctors about this. So they're already going to be feeding her more information that she then incorporated into her account. And it says later on here, when I first read her operative report at her mother's home in November 1994, the suburb here was incredulous. So he's doing this interview 3 years later. And I thought it's also interesting that he was reading her operative report at her mother's home, which suggested that Pam had access to the operative report, which gives her further information that she can incorporate into the story. Okay, so that's basically my so what I wanted to say there about that. Now, there's one point to be addressed, which is that some people will say that she was well, 32 degrees is still too cold for someone to be aware and awake. Now, generally, people won't be awake at that temperature, but again, this is not a standard type of experience. This is an unusual experience, and there is precedent for this. So, last couple of papers here, we're nearly there. Did I share the right thing? I didn't want to share that. Let's try again.
Yeah, it looked like a paper, but it went away.
Oh, well, it went to what? No, go away. It went to the wrong thing for me. Let's try again. Okay, this is what I wanted to share. So this is a case report of someone who. This is really crazy, actually. If I didn't read it here, I probably wouldn't believe it. So mild hypothermia, which starts at the level that the temperature that Pam was at just after. Just when she reports this experience, is recommending cardiac arrest and now part of standard post resuscitation. That's what we were just talking about. That was what was happening to her. Colder than that is unusual, but they report this 75-year-old homeless guy who was admitted to the ICU with a temperature of 23 degrees, and he was just found on a park bench in 3-degree weather, which is just absolutely insane. And it says, on admission, he was conscious with normal reflexes, but not able to answer adequately. So,
wow.
The GCS score was 7. I'm not exactly sure what that is. But I mean, that's crazy that he can be conscious at that low temperature, even if maybe not fully lucid. It says here, this is a rare case surviving accidental severe hypothermia without consequences, demonstrates that aggressive rewarming is also possible in conscious patients. So, we even have, I didn't even see this part of it.
A picture.
Yeah, there's even a picture and a graph of the temperature over time. Again, it'd be great to have this stuff in the case of the Pam Reynolds case. So the fact that he was 75 as well, like he must have an iron constitution, this guy.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that's way lower than Pam Reynolds was. And this guy was conscious. So it absolutely is possible to be conscious at those low temperatures, even if relatively unusual. Also, another thing that I wanted to mention here, and this is from the Spetzler paper as well. He actually mentions the rate of rewarming. That's hard to say.
Yeah.
Sorry?
I'm just saying, 0.2.
So 0.2 to 0.5 degrees Celsius per minute. So the reason I mention that is because some people might question exactly what temperature she was at when she reported that experience. But it says here that she was at 32 degrees. She was warmed up to 32 degrees. Her body was then de-instrumented and her surgical wounds closed. The younger assistants are taking over. And then the music comes on that Pam reports. So the point is that we don't know exactly what temperature she was at when that song came on, but the rewarming is fairly quick at this point. It would have only taken a few minutes for her to have warmed up even more than the 32. So I think that she was probably even not very hypothermic at the point she likely heard the song. We can't know for sure because we don't have those details. I mean, even if she was less than that, she could possibly have been conscious. It's just that it gets more likely as she gets warmer. But anyway, the point is that from a combination of things here, it's quite possible she could have had anesthesia awareness at that temperature and in the condition she was in and heard the song that was mentioned. Also,
here's a good one, James. So running time of the song here, 6 minutes, 30 seconds. And at 4 minutes, 20, we have the chorus playing or whatever it is. I think it's the verse. You can check out any time you'd like, but you can never leave. So the lower bound, if we do 0.2 times 4.2, because add arithmetic. So what's that? She could have gone 0.84 degrees warmer in that time. Is that right?
About a degree. Well, that's at the lower bound. Yeah. And
at the higher bound, then that's going to be about 2.1 degrees.
Yeah, and that's assuming that the song starts immediately on 32, and I think it's sometime later than that. Anyway, so we don't know the specifics, unlike, again, the other case, because I keep showing you studies where we have way better evidence in the Pam Reynolds case, which I think is telling as it is, because we have, the graphs of the temperature over time and the CIS scores and so forth. But the point is that her temperature doesn't rule this out, and as far as you know, her brain activity at the time doesn't rule that out either, given the evidence that I've shown. So a few final remarks based on the studies that I've found here. I think we can close that one. I can't actually remember where. Oh, actually, yeah, I think it might have been back in that book, so I'm going to share that again. Pam Reynolds is very clear that she talked to a lot of people about her experience. I can't remember if it was in here or I read this somewhere else, where she says that she talked to lots of different people. I feel like it was in this book, but now I can't seem to find it. But anyway, that's not really that hard to, not that unusual a claim. So I'll feel free to just assert that she talked about to lots of people, including the doctors. And it says here, she explicitly tells us that at this point here, when I came back, they were playing this song. I mentioned later to Dr. Brown that it was incredibly insensitive. So that's something that she's going to mention before she was discharged, I'm assuming, right? So she's talking to people at that time, when she was at the hospital, and they're already probably giving her details. For example, I don't even necessarily believe that she actually heard that specific song and the lyrics and remembered them. I suspect maybe she just caught the gist of the song and heard that it was rock music or something like that. And then she mentioned it and someone said, oh yeah, it was this song. And then she remembered that remembering that song. Again, I don't really know. It's sort of how much do you want the memory distortion to do compared to the anesthesia awareness, right? And there's no way I can know that. But I think that's kind of either way is plausible given what we know. Especially when it's clear that there was plenty of time for her to talk to people about this, and she talked to lots of people about it, and as she sort of developed her account. Was there anything else I wanted to say here? Oh, yeah, so Dr. Spetzler. Dr. Spetzler has been interviewed about this, and he says that he doesn't think it's possible that the patient could have experienced these things by natural means. He says here, if you would examine the patient from a clinical perspective during that hour, they were, by all definitions, dead. At this point, there's no brain activity, no blood going through the brain, nothing. We see how that's true but misleading, because when you actually look carefully at the timeline, the evidentiary parts did not occur during the time when she had no blood in her brain and when she had a flatline EEG and so forth. It was before and after that. So the thing is, you'd think Spetzler would know that, but he's maybe not being too cautious about looking into the precise details and going through and seeing where it fits in. Later on, he says here, one thing I learned after spending so many years of dealing with the brain is that nothing is impossible. So he makes these sort of vague claims about this where he doesn't really say anything much either way. He just sort of says, well, I don't know how it happened, but nothing is impossible, so who knows, kind of thing. Personally, I think that he kind of likes the attention that this gives him. If you actually look him up on YouTube, do a search for his name, you don't get a whole lot about Pam Reynolds, although there's a little bit, but there's this weird collection of like media appearances that I found. It's like 14 minutes long. If anyone's interested, you could have a look at it. But it's just like a compilation of times where he's gone on the news or whatever to talk about some operation that he did and saved a kid's life or whatever else. And I don't even think Pam Reynolds is even mentioned there. So, I mean, maybe that's not surprising. He's a fairly prominent surgeon. It's just that he seems to like the spotlight. There's lots and lots of these news snippets in that little report there. He also wrote a foreword to a book about a doctor's spiritual experiences with near death or something like that. So I get the impression that he kind of likes the attention this brings without necessarily wanting to endorse anything very specific.
Yeah.
That's speculative. I obviously don't know that, but I think it is consistent with what he says and some other things. So in conclusion, I think that is what I wanted to share with respect to my findings about this case. So I think the evidentiary aspects about the saw, the sight and sound of it, plus the snippet of conversation, plus the song at the end are explicable with a combination of memory distortions and anesthesia awareness. And the key point is that the earbuds would not have prevented this because she could still hear out of one ear, and the complete absence of blood and brain activity wouldn't have prevented this because that wasn't the case. That hadn't been induced at the points in the operation when the evidentiary aspects of the experience actually occurred. It was before and after this point. And so all of that is really irrelevant to the key claims of it. And what we do have is perfectly consistent with her experiencing anesthesia awareness before and after the burst suppression, and then later the complete flatline period. And then reporting these very shortly afterwards to the doctors or nurses and others, who then gave her more information that she incorporated into her account, and over the years as she shared this became more sort of consolidated and impressive and coherent in her head. And that's the report that she then recounted to Saboom. I say his name differently each time, that she recounted to that guy 3 years afterwards. And that's the report that we now have. Yeah. So is my account speculative? Yeah, because I don't know exactly what happened. But the question is there anything implausible or unreasonable about it or inexplicable? And I just don't see anything that's really inexplicable there on the basis of what we already know about anesthesia awareness, about burst suppression, about the nature of the operation, and other factors like that. So what do you think, Nathan? What do you think about all this?
I think what's interesting as well is as you've like looked into this, a lot of those details that you brought out, they not only do they like fill in why we have this kind of like report from Pam in particular, but it begins to like paint a picture of like why NDEs are occurring, how the human brain works. How it seems to be informative about the underlying nature of reality, and that doesn't seem to be the case with this alternative, like not an explanation that's being offered by the proponents of NDEs. And I find that really interesting. I mean, I think the whole thing's bizarre. I really think it stems from like a kind of existential anxiety. And I think as people, you know, to form beliefs, we need to be motivated by desires maybe in some way. I don't think facts just by themselves kind of motivate us. And so maybe it's that existential dread, the weirdness of life, you know, the needing it to be special or whatever, that leads some of these people to kind of find that reason. And then I think you see all the same kind of cognitive biases at work in people forming these beliefs. So it becomes this story about the way the world is that's kind of coherent and fits together. And then you see like confirmation biases and all those sorts of things going on in the people who are arguing for these things. And it's very difficult to convince someone who, you know, thinks these NDEs show something. You know, what was the quote from Janice that thinks that these NDEs show that what they experienced happened or something like that. Like someone who's taking that position, is very difficult to offer them any kind of evidence that they'll accept that is different from it being veridical. So any kind of natural, you know, whether oxygen depletion's involved in some sense, or high CO2 levels, or the limbic lobe, or memory distortions, or anesthesia awareness, it seems like there's nothing that they will actually accept that would naturally explain it. And I think that then that does just, it comes down to philosophy at that point. Like, what's our epistemology? How do we approach the evidence? What's the nature of explanation? And that's all you can do. And I think that James, with all this research, has done a much better job than I've seen even some of these, you know, PhD NDE researchers do in trying to offer an explanation for what's going on.
Yeah, I'm sure there's many details that I haven't got quite right, or other aspects to that. Because I'm not an expert in anesthesiology or anything, but you know, this is just me relying on my, you know, general scientific background from what I've studied, my general neuroscience background, and then just doing research into it and following up references. And really anyone can do this. This is the point I make. And this is why I like to show specific studies and highlight the things, show you the graphs and so on, so that you can kind of understand a bit more about how this all fits together, rather than just making claims about, oh, this guy said this and we should trust him because he's, you know, smart, or they did a study and found this, because that's just relying on people making their own biased interpretations about what people are saying. And for something like this that's contested and complicated, I don't really think that's sufficient. So again, I just don't see anything here that's really that compelling to me. It's certainly an unusual case, an unusual combination of events, but those things are not unexpected under physicalism. There's nothing fundamentally here that I think, you know, breaks the worldview or anything like that. And even if there was, it wouldn't really be evidence for anything in particular. It would just be an anomaly that we wouldn't have an explanation for. Until we get better explanations that can rival those of naturalism, then it's never going to be more than a series of anomalies, which maybe we can explain, maybe we can't, depending on how much detail we have. But the real limitation of Pam Reynolds, as I said multiple times, is there's just not enough information. We don't have the information that we would like to have, and we do have for controlled cases where people do study anesthesia awareness or study NDE reports, or, you know, body temperature changes and things like that. We just don't have that, and you know, until we have that, we're never going to be able to. And maybe that information doesn't exist. I don't know exactly what's in the surgeon's report, but absent that, there's a limit to what we can say from you know, from a scientific or naturalistic point of view, because we're going to have to make speculative inferences about what may have happened because we don't have enough detail to give specifics.
Yeah. Have you just passed the threshold to 1,000 subscribers now as well? Oh yeah, there we go.
Exciting. What happens? Do I transcend to some other realm, or
you transcend to AdSense, and you can now get 50 pence per video.
Oh, exciting. Raking in the big bucks. This is why I do it. A comment about the video. I just remembered that we started this off with that evidence that the soul exists video. If you recall, they made a lot of dubious claims. Like they talked about the whole flatline blood drain thing. which recall is not relevant at all to Pam Reynolds' case because it's clear just from the timeline of the surgery that her awareness reports occur before and after that, not during that period. And this is repeatedly misreported when you hear about this this case. What else did they say in this? That there was the issue of them showing a lot of the sort of reenactment or stock footage or whatever it is that's a bit misleading because we don't actually have that. I think they also failed to mention that it was 3 years afterwards that the interview was done, which I think cast it in a bit of a different light. So there are a few other things there. I think there are a couple of others that I've forgotten. But I mean, the point is that the evidence is just really not very compelling and is misrepresented in a lot of these cases. And it wouldn't take nearly as long to articulate this. I mean, you know, I went through a lot of detail and showed studies, but you could condense the basics of this into a 5-minute video, right? If you just wanted to say, well, here's the procedure, here's the timeline, she experienced this then, and then this then, and then she was aware then, and then, and you know, the fundamentals isn't that difficult. It's just people will critique and they'll nitpick unless you go through the details. But what I want to wonder is for people like JP Moreland, who was interviewed in that video, do they really think that this should be convincing evidence for skeptics? Because this is like one of the main cases they put up as being the strongest evidential, and it's terrible. Like, the evidence is so weak; it's basically anecdotes from 3 years later, and that would never hold up in court for anything. For example, like that's just bad evidence. Even if we couldn't account for the claims that she made, it's still low quality evidence, and I think that we can at least partially account for it, as I've argued. But why should someone change their mind about, you know, the metaphysical worldview and the ontology of the universe on the basis of this sort of quality evidence? It kind of baffles me when they sort of are skeptical about other things, but then they just make these extravagant claims on the basis of really low quality evidence.
Yeah, and I think for the kind of dualism that JP Moreland is arguing for, this like theistic interactionism, I don't know whether he's like, you know, an occasionalist or wound up clock view or whatever, but like, it's like, why is God doing it that way? Like, what's causing the interactions to appear in this way, where she's sort of located near the body but not quite in it? Or how's she getting sight? Is God just causing those perceptions from a different, like, there's all sorts of weird things going on with that as an explanation of the NDE experience that don't, well, at least don't make any sense to me. Like, I'd want to hear what like someone like JP Moreland has to say about that, if he's saying that, if he's offering that as a model that explains, you know, the phenomenology of the Pam Reynolds case. Like, why on dualism, on his version of dualism, what does he think's happening? Is God saying, okay, you know, you're going to hear Hotel California now for a bit, or you're going to like, and just, you know, even though her ears are clogged up with, so she can't, you know, if we take the NDE as explanation, so she can't hear anything through her ears, so God just decides, you know, to put the sound into her soul or something. Like, what is the alternative?
Yeah, well, this is why I think the competing explanations need to be offered, because you have to establish what we're comparing a naturalistic explanation to. And whenever someone tries to give these explanations, I think they're all horrendously bad, because you start running into a lot of thorny issues like overdetermination. So when we hear and see, is that caused by our sensory organs, or is it caused by some sort of immaterial aspect of soul or whatever? Because if it's the former, then it just doesn't seem possible that we could see or hear, even if we somehow were separated from our bodies, because we need eyes and ears to see and hear. Just like Eric said, we see and hear through means of our eyes and ears, right? So that seems to imply that absent those, you can't see and hear, which I think is a more classical way of understanding dualism. But then if you say, no, actually, we don't need eyes and ears to hear, then what is it that they're doing? Because it seems that they're causally sufficient to generate that. And we have a lot to say about how that works, right? And you want to say, well, yes, it's sufficient, but then there's this additional cause as well that sometimes, or maybe always, I don't know, also causes you to hear. It just doesn't really make sense. That if one thing is sufficient for the effect, then how is it that this other thing is also causing it? And then you have further questions like, well, if you're seeing, then that means you're interacting with electromagnetic radiation, and if you're hearing, it means that there's some sort of detection of sound, of vibrations in the air, and that should be, first of all, that's going to violate conservation of energy, because there's going to be interaction with something non-physical there. And second of all, that should be detectable. We should be able to measure that violation there. And then why is it that these non-physical things only interact with sight and sound, apparently in these really weird cases? Why don't they interact with it in other cases? Like, what causal process is sort of determines when this soul is somehow interacting with these things? And why is it only when we do anesthesia to the brain that somehow means that it starts interacting with light in a different way? And then how are those memories transferred back into the brain such that they can be reported when you're conscious again? Like, how does that work? It just sort of scrambles your neurons back when it comes into your brain. How does that work? Plus another violation of conservation of energy. None of this makes any sense if you try to actually articulate it. Plus it makes a bunch of predictions, which I think could easily be falsified if you went to the effort to do it, although it probably wouldn't be worth it. But no one would want to test that, because I don't think anyone would actually commit themselves to this view, because they know it would be easily falsified, and they go say, no, it's something else, but they never actually say what it is.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So I mean,
I put the timestamp. I put the timestamp in the Jan video as about 1 hour 33 for 5 minutes. If you wanted to go to that, but if you want to wrap it up here as well, that is okay.
The Jan video about what?
The Jan video where I was talking to her and I kind of pressed her on.
Oh yeah. So what was the timestamp there?
About 1 hour 33 minutes.
Let's do it. It's a good way to end out.
I don't know that I am particularly. I don't know. I did a particularly good job. I think I was pretty tired and stuff.
Share audio. 1 hour 33.
Yeah, just before 1 hour 33. I think like 1:32:50. Yeah, something.
But
why is that? I don't understand why that is like a worse explanation than like this whole other like thing exists in reality that we now have to commit to our ontology and believe in, and like ghosts and mediums and like that's basically the difference. Is I'm saying like all those natural coincidences for me are a better explanation than like mediumship is real, ghosts exist, and consciousness is like this great universal one. And that really is the difference.
Because there's all these different experiences as well that take place, as well as this that suggest it.
Right, but that's the difference. Is you're saying it's really unlikely, and I agree, like it's improbable. But that's then I just say it's improbable. For context, if
you just take the other route and add all.
Pause a second. What we're talking about here is, so there was like this bird that someone said, if you die, send me this bird, and then there's like a video of the bird landing on them, and they're like, oh shoo, go away, and the bird flies back or something. And then I guess that he's saying, well, it makes sense of all the data, because you say, well, there's people in the afterlife that for some reason can cause birds to do things. And NDEs are also an experience of that afterlife. And mediumship is also people who and reincarnation is sometimes people come back. And so they're piecing together all these things to say, well, we've got this non-explanation which accounts for all of them that physicalism can't. Whereas I guess I'm saying that I think you're also committed to. This is what I articulated badly. I think you're also committed to the idea that, you know, sometimes animals are going to want to hang around people for food that they've got or something, and that has nothing to do with mediumship. And you're also committed to the idea that like memory distortions exist, or that, you know, people who are going through trauma and grief will like see things. But then you're saying that additionally, sometimes it's also actually because, you know, a dead person told the bird to go and visit them, and it does that somehow.
Yeah, this response by Darren is really unsatisfactory, and it is illustrative of the whole sort of I don't know what the word for this is. Proof by anecdotes. It's like, okay, well, how do I know that there's more to the Pam Reynolds case, say, than just the brain acting up or doing something weird that we don't understand? Well, the reason I know is because of this other case and this other case and this other case. And the thing is that there's a reluctance to hang too much on any one case. I mean, and granted, one case doesn't prove everything, but each case should be evidential by itself. You can't say that a case is evidential because other cases exist. That doesn't make any sense. That the case should be evidential in its own right, not definitive perhaps, but it should be evidential in its own right. And so you should be able to say why the case provides evidence for some conclusion, even if it's only partial evidence. And then you say, here's another case that provides more partial evidence. That's how a cumulative case works. It doesn't work by whenever someone presses you on one point, changing the topic and talking about a different point. By the way, this is what some apologists do as well, where you press them about one point and they'll say, well, there's lots of other reasons as well. That's not actually a response. That's just changing the topic.
Have you heard the term yellow brick road apologetics before?
I haven't, no.
So it's like sort of like the Emerald Cities at the end, and you just sort of lay down the yellow bricks, you know, that lead towards it, sort of thing. I think it's something Cam Spears talks about a lot, but maybe
I think I've heard something like that, where it's like, how does it go? If it's like if where does the yellow brick road lead to? I've forgotten. How does it work again?
The Emerald City.
The Emerald City, yeah. So I think it's something like if the Emerald City doesn't exist, then where does the yellow brick road lead to? Something like that. It's changing the topic and trying to present something else as if it's evidence for when you actually haven't established that there's anything, there's any phenomena at all, actually. I don't know if that's exactly the same thing, but I think it's related here. It's basically saying, well, there's these other things you also can't explain. Well, hang on, we're talking about this one at the moment. Let's focus on that. Because you see, I did hours of research looking into the Pam Reynolds case and trying to get the details as accurate as I could get them. But then you can just throw in 100 more cases and say, what about this? What about this? What about this? And I'm not going to spend my whole life, following up every case that someone says is evidential, right? Yeah, I'll look at some of the main ones, but if I look at them and spend hours and they're really lame and not even close to what I would ask for, then how much faith or trust am I going to give that these other ones that you sort of vaguely refer to are going to be any better? So you need to establish that. That's why it's important to pick a couple of good cases and then really push those and see what evidential value they can provide, and not just change the topic when someone presses you on them.
Yeah. All these things in, which, like you can phrase it and say, but that's really silly explanation to go with, but it's like, well, saying it's really improbable, that's really silly because it's really improbable, or that's really silly because, you like ghosts, mediums, like, that's basically where we hit the impasse, I think.
Oh. Yeah, and it has more to do with the way that you're framing things with your language. Like, and the show did that too. A lot of this seems like framing to me rather than like comparative evidence. Like, oh, well, I like this explanation better, and that one is silly. That's what I'm hearing.
Right, but I'm showing you that the footage. And
right, and I'm saying there's an alternative explanation to
which
how the footage.
Which is possible,
okay.
But with all the other phenomena, terminal lucidity and near-death veridical perceptions, other forms of after communication, and other things, I think the most probable explanation is that there is something to all this, and plus the levels of coincidence that's needed in terms of synchronicity for that to be the case. Otherwise, you're just appealing to the fact that the lady either misremembered something, which is possible, or is lying.
Yeah, and well, I guess again, that's where I'd say. So even.
What's wrong with those as explanations, by the way? That she misremembered or was lying? Those things happen, right? Just like, oh no, they can't be misreporting or misremembering. Like that, no, we just have to take everything at face value. That's not good skepticism when you just take everything at face value. It's just,
the conjunctive probability of like temporal lobe syndrome, hypoxia, whatever, in all these cases, in the different combinations, and the things we don't yet know about how the brain works, all those things combined, they're still more probable than committing ghosts and things to my ontology.
How much research have you read about the relationship between oxygen level and reporting or not reporting a near-death experience after resuscitation from cardiac arrest?
Only.
Yeah, Nathan, how much have you read about it, huh? Have you read this study? Have you read this book? Nathan, huh? How much have you read? Why should we listen to you, huh?
Well, I got annoyed here because I'm going to say, well, only really Carol Zaleski reporting on it. And then she goes, oh, isn't Carol Zaleski like crap because she's like religious studies person? And I was like, Carol Zaleski had clearly put a ton of research into being as unbiased as she possibly could, reporting on these things. So that I got kind of frustrated at her after she said that.
Well, see, this is just an ad hominem attack in disguise, because the question is how good are the arguments, not like how educated are you about something. Now, if you are uneducated about something, that could be relevant, but what you should do is focus on that point. Like, okay, so here's something that's relevant, which you might not be aware of. Not like, how much reading have you done about this? That's not how you do something if you're interested in genuine dialogue.
Yeah, digital don't know sis.
Yeah, that's a good one.
What Carol Zaleski has collated together in her.
Zaleski wrote a book about ancient near-death experiences, but
she's written several books, not just that one.
Well, there's actually research in which oxygen and carbon dioxide level were measured during resuscitation from cardiac arrest. And what they found was no relationship between the levels of those gases in the blood and the likelihood that a person would or would not report a near-death experience. So in other words, you might have two people with high levels of oxygen in their blood during the whole episode, and one reports a near-death experience and the other doesn't, or two people with high carbon dioxide in their blood, and one reports a near-death experience and one doesn't. So there's no relationship between blood gases. I mean, it is so easy to sit and say this without knowing what research has been done.
Yeah, it's very easy to say, there's been this study which shows what you're saying is wrong, but Ernst A. Roden, a neurologist who scrutinizes his own near-death experience in an article in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, The Reality of Death Experiences, A Personal Perspective, he attributes his near-death experience to hypoxia, even though it was one of the happiest moments of his life. Now, I'm not attributing all cases
right to do that, but one, one case is not.
Yeah, but that's not
what value of.
But this isn't what I'm doing. I'm saying
and neither is one study either. By the way, studies need to be replicated.
More evidential than one case. A study of several people is more evidential than.
Yeah, but what was your study that you said this study exists that refutes you? But that's the level of it. You didn't say who it was by. You didn't say what the sample size was.
Yeah, I can send you the reference if you want it.
But I can send you a reference back that's against your position. Like this is the problem is if you have a false belief, how would you find out?
Do you mean a study in which numerous people their blood gases were measured during resuscitation from cardiac arrest, and it showed a relationship between blood gas level and report of near-death experiences? I would like to see that study because I'm not aware that.
So I have to interject that this is so disingenuous on her point, because listening to what you were saying before this, I'm not entirely sure where you were going because you sort of got cut off, but I think you were just sort of presenting a picture of, well, there's lots of things going on and we don't necessarily know. And then you were driving at how can you make different inferences or something like that. You just threw out the low oxygen, I think, as a vague example of this sort of thing from what I gather. It wasn't really the point at all of what you were saying. And she just sort of got latched onto that point and then made this. I looked up the study that I think she's referencing. It's, I think, entirely uninteresting because
someone put in the in the comments under this one, someone actually linked a study that shows exactly what I was saying. So you've got this study that she's citing that says the opposite, and you've got this other study that's saying the opposite. Just like I said, there would be out there, because I know about CO2 and people do the Wim Hof breathing where they hyperventilate and increase the CO2 levels, and they have like crazy experiences of this and that.
Yeah, so I'm not. Yeah, one of the studies she's looked at, I think, talked about the importance of CO2 rather than oxygen. But the point is, though, that see, it's all about the interpretation of studies like that. Yeah, first of all, there's different studies that potentially show conflicting evidence. You can't just focus on one, like she was wanting to do. And then she's saying, well, interestingly, she said a single case doesn't prove something. Well, does that mean Pam Reynolds doesn't prove something? If we're going to throw out single cases now, can we throw out those? What can you conclude from that? I mean, does that mean that low oxygen levels are contributing to NDEs? You can't even infer that, because, I mean, this is just basic methodology, right? Even if there's no correlation within a certain range, that only establishes that over that range, there's no relationship. It doesn't mean that there's actually no effect. Like, I'm just trying to think of an analogy to explain this. So a good one doesn't come off the top of my head, but you might say that maybe there's no relationship between air conditioner use and temperature over the range of like 35 to 40 degrees Celsius, maybe. I mean, they're probably, I'm just making that up, right? Because maybe people don't really change their air conditioner use over that level. Like 35 degrees, 40 degrees, maybe it doesn't matter that much. But that doesn't mean that there's no relationship between temperature and air conditioner use. It just means over that range, there's no level. So if you're just looking at people who are under anesthesia, or I don't know exactly, I can't remember what the case was, just because there's no correlation over that range, they're probably all fairly low oxygen level ranges. It doesn't mean that there's no effect of having a below normal oxygen level. I'm not saying that there is. I'm just saying that there's a whole host of issues about interpreting a result like that and just explaining what it actually means. I mean, and even if that doesn't work out, well, that doesn't disprove anything about it. Just, okay, so it's not just a low oxygen level. There's probably other things going on as well, right? So you have to enrich the picture there. And that's fine. She's allowed to refer to results like this, but she's pulling it out just to hammer you in the face with it. As in, you don't know this. You're being dumb because you're not informed. When she doesn't even give a reference, she doesn't explain why this result is that significant or how to interpret it or give any of that, which I always try to do, at least when I refer to these papers. And she's not using it to enlighten the audience. Exactly. It really upsets me when I see that, especially the tone that she's doing it with, which is really uncharitable. And I think you kept your cool much better than I would have in that conversation. I probably would have been out when she said the flat earth thing, to be honest. I don't know if I would have gotten this far. But anyway, let's keep going.
That's ever been the result of a study like that.
I'm trying to find it.
But I think the question is, though, that if you did have a false belief on what's happening here, how would you find out? Are you trapped in a false belief if you have one? Because you said you know that this is true. And you've said that because you're in this elect group of people who know, that you couldn't be convinced out of it.
Well, I can't be convinced away from my experience. Now, one does, going back to the guy who attributes his NDE to hypoxia, he has every right to do that. One doesn't subjectively experience hypoxia. So it's a deduction that he's made that, he has every right to do. But it's different, if I've been to Barcelona, Spain, and you're trying to tell me I haven't been there, sorry, I've just been there. I know.
Okay, so do the interior angles of all triangles add up to 100?
Okay, so before you get on to that point, I wasn't sure that this was the best way to go, but anyway.
Yeah, I know. I came up with a bad example. I wanted to be fast for like the rhetorical point, but it was like, I was like, why have I gone with this example? This is so stupid. But yeah.
But what she says there is really interesting, because it's just like this motivated skepticism. It's like, hypoxia is not something you experience, it's something you infer or a way you explain experience. And I agree with that, although there are typical symptoms of hypoxia like confusion and things like that. But that's a phenomenology, not the same as the interpretation or the explanation of it. Fair enough. But then what I want to ask is, how does she experience the fact that her consciousness is more than just what her brain can produce? What is the experiential content that allows her to directly perceive that? Surely that's an inference or explanation that she's drawing to account for her experience, not the content of the experience itself. Like, I don't understand how you can directly experience that.
A deduction, Watson.
Exactly. Or an abductive inference, something.
Well, but no, I'm saying because she said deduction in her, and the right logician part of me wanted to be uncharitable and just jump on, something she says that I know about.
Yeah.
And
yeah, fair enough. But yeah, that's a good point. It's she doesn't seem to realize that's exactly what she is doing, because I think Kant made this point, right? That we basically never have access to things in themselves. We only have access to our experiences of them, and we need to make inferences about what's happening behind the scenes, so to speak, or behind what we can directly perceive. So I think that's what's happening in both cases here. And this is what I was saying earlier on. What we need to do is present the phenomena, the evidence, the accounts, the experiments, and so forth, and then construct competing accounts for them to explain how that can explain what gives rise to all of these phenomena, and then compare the explanatory virtues of each of those competing explanations, and see which is better. And my contention is, although we don't have a full naturalistic account or scientific account for these things, there's much more substance that can be put to that, such as some of the things that I talked about with anesthesia awareness and memory reconstruction, and awareness during resuscitation, which we looked at in the previous discussion. Much more that can be said about that, much more evidence behind it than any of the NDEs have when they try to give accounts. And many of them don't even try because they know that they really can't. But even those who do try, I think there's massive problems with them that we've discussed before. So whenever we compare explanations, I think the naturalists or the materialists or science explanations win, even though there's a lot of limitations of them, to be sure. But now she's somehow trying to claim that the naturalists need to make inferences, but somehow the people like her don't have to make inferences, and they just directly perceive somehow that there's more to reality than there's more to consciousness than their brain. She compares it to visiting Spain, but like, how is that in any way comparable?
It's not. Here's why it's not analogous, and how it begs the question of what she's saying. Her example of if I have gone to Spain and I tell you I have an experience of going to Spain, then I went to Spain. It's like, yeah, because in the hypothetical, you did go to Spain. But then it's like, so if I have left my body with my consciousness and have the experience of it, it's like, yeah, but I'm saying that you didn't. It's like, it's not analogous.
Exactly.
That's the very thing in question. The thing in question.
We know that Spain exists. We know that other people go there. There's a lot of knowledge we have about Spain. Spain not existing would be extremely hard to account for with everything else we believe. None of that is true with respect to the place or whatever it is that the Janus thinks exists. We don't know that it exists. No one agrees about what it's like. Most people haven't gone there. Those who have, again, can't agree about anything about it. We can't tell that it exists. It not existing would be, I think, more consistent with our background evidence. So this is why it's disanalogous to the Spain case. Well, V doesn't actually agree that all countries exist. It occurs to me, so maybe maybe there's a bit. Yeah. Australia doesn't exist.
But yeah, it's just
from Spain. I should have from Spain.
No, V is from Spain, but she ran away to go to school in France for a few years.
Well, she's just claiming that Spain doesn't exist, so that seems to be a bit hard to reconcile with her existence. But anyway, that's for her to
but
work out.
it's just that in the hypothetical, she's like, if I have gone to Spain and as the antecedent on that. So it's like, if I have left my body and have the experience of leaving my body, well, one of the conjuncts on the antecedent is that I have left my body. It's like, but that's the thing we're trying to establish. You can't just assume it.
Well, this is what I was saying before. The reasoning is just not clear here. Like, nowhere is it explained how we can get to the conclusion that there's something more to consciousness than the material brain or whatever it is. It's just these sort of things that are said and evidence is appealed to in an abstract way, but it's not put together in an argument that makes sense. And at least this is where people like William Lane Craig have a step up, because at least their argument is actually like a valid argument, and you can just dissect the premises. Here, we have to work out what they're even arguing. And it's very hard to make sense of it, because I would have said that they're appealing to an inference to the best explanation, but they seem to reject that by refusing to offer an alternative explanation. So again, I can't even tell what the argument is supposed to look like as to how we're supposed to get to the conclusion, other than it's something you directly experience. If, as you say, you're one of the elect that has this experience, that seems to be it's almost like William Lane Craig, who says he has this direct experience and what is it? An intrinsic defeater, where any argument against it just automatically defeated. It's almost what she's saying here, even if not in those words.
Yeah. And then this Muppet's going to talk about triangles. I wish I'd gone straight to the bent stick in water sort of thing, because that's what I'm trying to draw out, is that there's these examples of things she has experiences of where she doesn't just accept her phenomenology as the
exactly.
But I don't know why I shouldn't have. Yeah,
we want to hear the triangles now. So
180 degrees.
I don't know. I guess they do. I don't remember.
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
What a weird response. It's like she doesn't know that triangles have 180 degrees. Anyway.
Well, that's not true, because triangles on.
Oh, sorry.
Well, it was just silly of me, because it's like like geometry is like an a priori thing or whatever. I was trying to just quickly think of an example though of like what's something that they will agree to, like phenomenologically, but where the explanation is actually different. And I was like, like I wanted to go to like Bigfoot and UFOs and stuff, but I wasn't even sure because.
Oh, she probably believe in those as well, given what else she said.
Yeah.
What do you say for someone like that? Like, can you think of something crazy that they don't?
So that's why I went to That's why I went to triangles. I was like, surely on triangles, they're going to be wrong. Like, it's just going to be like, yeah, you look at a triangle, it's 180 degrees interior angles. But yeah, it was a stupid example.
It is a bit. I mean, she elsewhere mentions people who know statistics, but for someone who doesn't know that a triangle has 180 degrees, that the interior angles sum to 180 degrees on flat.
No, the spearman's rank.
Anyway,
yeah, curve. The concave side will have less than 180 degrees. The convex side will have more than 180 degrees. The point is, we can experience something and be wrong about it. We have to actually do empirical investigation into it to see what's actually going on.
Agree.
Like I can, like I can see a bent stick in water and it appears bent, but that doesn't mean that I'm actually seeing a bent stick.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely true. Mm-hmm.
Okay, should we move on to the next episode?
So she doesn't actually address your point. She says she's experienced something, and then you say, yeah, but we can't always rely on the way our experiences seem to show that the way reality is, because sometimes we can be misled. And she just says yes. Now, I get the idea that she has to go soon. She doesn't really want to talk to you anymore about it. But there's not even an attempt to say something there. It's again, just disappointing, because that's kind of critical here. Because she said she thinks that NDEs are what they appear to be. And we can first ask, what do they appear to be? But also we can ask, even if you establish what they appear to be, well, how do you know that they are what they appear to be and people are not being misled in different ways? And she just doesn't have anything to say to that, it seems, at least that she's willing to share here, which is disappointing, because that's a fundamental question here. I think she leaves now, is it?
Because I have to go in like 10 minutes.
Sure, not a problem. Okay, we'll have to do it very briefly then. Jan, you want to do your review of episode?
Yeah, I think.
Okay, so that's the end of the NDE part. Yeah, I don't really want to go through all of what are the other things that you looked at? It was like
reincarnation was one of the episodes, and and it was the exact same case as that one I sent you, where where Doug was kind of having a bit of a laugh at the mum like telling the kid what to say and stuff. The little pilot, a guy who thought he was an actor and stuff. There was mediumship with 3 of them, and I said, this is clearly a scam and it's morally reprehensible because there's like vulnerable people who are being exploited. And then they said, you're just presupposing naturalism here. And
I remember. Yeah. So Darren, I keep forgetting his name. He said that, you can't say that they're exploiting people because you're assuming that they're not true.
Know that,
you don't know that they're, like, seriously, every new cult or anything like this that he comes across, he's like,
exactly.
I have to refrain from making any judgments because they might actually
First
be
time I
God
spend
reincarnated.
the rest of my life. Yeah. I've
That
got
is
to
so
read,
ridiculous.
Like, these 50 like theological volumes of
And see, the thing is here that people like us are, especially like me, but I think us generally, are accused of being hyper skeptical. You can't live like that because you have to have knowledge to get through the day. The thing is, though, that I think it goes the other way around. If you're so open-minded that you refuse to say this person who claims to be God or Jesus or Buddha or whatever, and has this harem of followers and gets people to give up all their livelihood, all this stuff, right? If you're unwilling to say, that person is either deluded or a huckster or something like that, then there's something wrong with your epistemology, because that's totally unlivable, because then you basically have to be saying that you need to devote all this time to investigating every single one of these groups to see if the bold claims that they make are actually true. But no one actually does that. So I think that's the actually unlivable epistemology, not the sort of skepticism that we tend to have, which actually, has a sort of a worldview, broadly speaking, if not in all particulars. And if things are well outside that, then we say, well, I'm pretty skeptical about that. We need a fair bit of evidence to get me over the line there.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
I thought that's, and again, I think I had another bad example really with him where I was like, oh, if I had a cult or a commune or whatever, and but I should have drawn out the, like with Christianity, for example. Like, I know he hasn't particularly looked into Christianity, and yet I'm sure he's like morally against, like the weird stuff they do in Pentecostal churches where they have kids like speaking in tongues, and if the ones who are like, oh, I can't do it, they make them stand in the naughty corner until they can, and there's all these kids like crying. I'm sure if he watched one of those videos, he'd be like, this is shocking, this is child abuse. And yeah, it's like, well, hang on, how much research have you done into the Book of Acts and the day of Pentecost? Like, have you done like textual criticism and redaction criticism and to decide that what's being said in the Book of Acts isn't really divinely inspired? And
yeah, I think the most interesting thing to do with these sort of people is run arguments from traditions they don't accept. So, run a minimal facts argument against the NDEs and see what they say, and then run a reincarnation evidence argument against Habermas and see what he says about that. This is the interesting. And generally, I mean, we sort of did this in the video where we looked at the competing traditions, my view is special or whatever, and we saw how they responded to each other. And they basically make the same arguments that we do against all these things that they don't agree with, right? So it's just, I think it's very interesting how that happens. They draw on all the same resources, but just don't apply them to their own sort of pet views. At least it seems like that with the case with a lot of people. Maybe there are some who have a very principled way to respond to things. But I mean, again, I like to say that I try to have a fairly consistent set of epistemological standards that I apply when assessing any claim or any sort of evidence. And then if something can meet that, then as it meets that, it's a sort of a spectrum thing, then I take it more and more seriously. And that's why I think it's interesting to try to pit these things against each other, where, okay, if you accept people reporting things, then you should also accept all of these other claims where people report things with a similar level of, evidence behind it. But people don't, and that's the thing. And I've yet to see a very principled comparative analysis of how to do this. And actually, this is one of the things that I do in the chapter on the resurrection here, because I look at comparative miracle cases. I construct, I think, what is one of the best compendiums, if I do so myself, of evidence miracle claims from different traditions and parapsychology and other things as well. And the challenge is for someone to develop an account that allows one of these to be like paranormal or supernatural or whatever, while all the others are false, or at least those that don't fit within the tradition to be false. Whereas I don't think you can do that. I think that the only sort of consistent position is to essentially explain them
or accept them all.
Well, yeah, except I don't even know how accepting them all works, but maybe if you have a sufficiently permissive ontology, you could do that. But most people don't want to do that. They see even people who are like, I believe there are many paths to spirituality. I mean, that's rejecting a certain understanding, the orthodox understanding of Christianity and Islam, and even some versions of Buddhism and Hinduism as well. So like you can't even get there because not everyone's as permissive, right? So you have to disagree with some people, and then you have to give an explanation for how do you decide who you're going to agree with and who you're going to disagree with, what you're going to accept and what you're going to reject. And I think that by appealing to these sorts of naturalistic style phenomena like memory distortions, cognitive biases, and various neurological phenomena, and other things we talked about today, and I report in my book, and these sorts of things, that is sufficient to account for all of these sorts of reports that people give of unusual and super normal phenomena that they experience. And the challenge is how to show that one type of these phenomena or an event has enough evidence to justify believing that, but not all of the others, is actually something that's beyond natural explanation. And that's something that I've not seen a convincing response to.
Yeah. Right. So what are we thinking? Wrap it up around here?
Yeah, I think that about does it with what I want to say. Any concluding remarks or last reflections on that discussion that you wanted to make?
I mean, I wasn't particularly on the ball in that discussion.
What would you give your own entertainment and evidential ranking out of 10?
Yeah. I thought it was. There's some discussions I have sometimes where like I'm just not in the game, whether I'm tired or whatever, or maybe I just don't know what the hell I'm talking about. Maybe that's why. But that was one of those that was like particularly bad. I don't think the format facilitated particularly good discussion as well, because
it was
there
weird.
was so much content for each person to try and get out, and it didn't feel like everyone was really given their sort of fair time to articulate that. And there was so many of us as well with these differing point of views that wanted time to get across. It would have been better to reduce the content of what we were talking about to one particular claim or something, and then allow discussion around that and allow each person some time to and back and forth on that maybe. So that didn't help. But I think looking back, it's not. I mean, some of my counterexamples and things weren't great, but I think considering that I barely knew what I was talking about, but was able to kind of push back on what she was offering as like a professional researcher who does this and stuff, and show that she's not offering an explanation. She's displaying all these biases in the way that she interprets and comes to processing the information. And basically, it's this personal reason that she had an experience that's really important to her, and she believes she can't be wrong about for whatever reason. And I don't think she's thought that through. It's like the question of well, if the Holy Spirit's talking to you and Mormons get this burning in the bosom, if we take a step back, how do we say who's right there? Like those sort of questions. I don't think she's really ever thought about that. And this is consistent across people who are in religions and things. I don't think they've ever really thought about those sorts of things, honestly. If they're just honest with themselves, then they'll believe what I believe, as Braxton Hunter says. But yeah, I don't know. It was a weird one. It's been interesting to look at these NDEs and things. I've got a couple more books that I do want to read on the subject and find a bit more out. And I don't think I'm closed off to it, but it just seems like all of these natural explanations are like chipping away, helping us understand why the brain does what it does, explaining the cases that we do have. And I'm really to come across anything that, I mean, at least when someone first tells you the story and they've constructed this like sophisticated defense of why naturalism doesn't work, at first that seems like, oh, this is pretty weird. But then when you actually start looking into it, like some of those things, like you were bringing out when I wasn't paying attention about the saw. The saw is used to do the very thing that would have to have happened for her to then be like not conscious after it. So it's like, of course she like all these little details, they're just not put in like chronological order. It's not really, it's just like it's just a bit of a mess when you get into the weeds of it. And I think that you've done a really good job with all that research and stuff, right, of trying to draw some of those weeds apart. And but it's like you say, can we really be expected to just spend our lives going through an infinite list of like anecdotes and things?
Yeah, I know. So the final count there is 19 PDFs I've got here in the Pam Reynolds folder. That's just Pam Reynolds' case, the stuff related to her.
Right.
And so, and that represents, I don't know how many hours of research, probably more than 10, less than 100. So, and then they say there's hundreds of cases. You can never look at them all. But, you can do your best in the context of, the worldview that you think is best evidence. And that's what I try to do here. So obviously I'm coming from a naturalistic, scientific, materialistic point of view. The question is, from my point of view, is do we have sufficient reason or evidences to move beyond that and postulate additional things? Because most people agree the material world exists, at least in some form. The question is there anything beyond that? And I've not found the evidence to warrant believing in that. And the thing about these cases, not just near death, but others as well, from parapsychology, from miracles and other things, is that there are always reports that come afterwards. And I think the biggest lesson that I have, not just from this, but from reading about lots of other things, is that you just don't accept reports at a face value. You assume that this is a constructed account that's been developed after the fact to pursue an agenda, basically. And that agenda might just be someone wanting to believe that what they experienced was real. It might not be anything more than that. Of course, often it is, right? There may be a financial interest or an ideological or some other interest behind it. But it could just be that people really want to believe that they were special and they had something special happen to them. So, and that can be unconscious as well. It doesn't have to be a deliberate agenda. So just as a general point, I would say never just take what is said on face value. Assume that this is a constructed account that significantly distorts, not totally made up out of whole cloth, which is often the false dichotomy that some people say, oh, they just made it all up. No, they probably didn't make it all up, although that rarely happens. But usually it's a distorted version of what actually occurred. And so the question then is to not take it at face value, to say, I'm going to need more details before I can really analyze that. And if you're not given those details, I don't think that there's any obligation to really say anything much about it at all, other than, I don't know, there's not enough information for me to say much of anything about it. That doesn't then become evidential just because you can't explain it. If there's not enough information to explain, then yeah.
This is the problem in those scenarios, though, when these type of, like when these NDE people talk to you, you're going to go, yeah, that's weird. There's not enough information. And then what they're going to do, they're going to say, well, you know, Pam Reynolds, and she had the thing in her ear and it was clicking and she couldn't have, so it couldn't have been any other way. And you know, the Aware study, well, he saw the guy in the blitz, so it couldn't have been. And they're going to start like telling you all the stuff that they know and like be like, so now you need to accept my position. Now join Michael. Like,
yeah, exactly. So generally what I'll try to do is give the benefit of the doubt and look into the top couple of what they have to say, arguments or evidences. And I try to do that for as many different worldviews as I can, as long as you can find thoughtful people to talk to. And that guy, Darren, seemed reasonably thoughtful and intelligent, although I think he had a clear bias coming at things. I mean, I do as well, but at any rate. Yeah. So he'd be an interesting guy to discuss with. But the point is that you're not going to have an answer for all of these things because it's just impossible. People can produce nonsense or just unverified claims way faster than you can ever attempt to counter them. So for a lot of things, what I think some skeptics try to do is just always offer ad hoc explanations for everything, even if they really have if they don't know any of the details. And sometimes that can be useful, but a lot of the time I think it's something to avoid just because it's easy. Some of those things will be easily disproven, and that somehow is taken as evidence against there being any explanation, which it isn't. It's just, okay, that particular one wasn't right. But anyway, so I guess the general advice from my point of view is avoid trying to do that in general. You can sometimes offer general considerations like memory biases or things, or perceptual biases or things like that. But in general, I think it's fine to say, I don't know, there's not enough information for me to regard this as being evidence for anything in particular. I would need more specifics. And then if those can be provided, then you can look into the specifics. And in every case that I've ever looked at, the evidence is way, way less compelling when you look into the specifics. As we've given as an example here. So yeah, that's my takeaway. And I guess it's also just disappointing that a lot of people are so selective, it seems to me, in the way that they are really critical about, any naturalistic explanation, but just uncritically accept reports that people make or a study that seems to support their view without, forgetting that it was, 20 years or 18 years after the fact, for example. So hopefully that was of interest to people. I know 3 hours on Pam Reynolds might be a bit much for some, but there's so much thrown around about it that I thought a more in-depth discussion was necessary. Geez, V, you have to push really close to home, don't you? Or why am I streaming for 3 hours on Valentine's Day? Yeah. Okay. So what does that say about me? Okay, fine. I'm finishing now. So thanks everyone for for listening. Hope you found this interesting. And
hope you feel bad, V.
Yeah, thanks for making me feel bad about myself. Thanks for 100,000 subscribers as well. Appreciate that. Looking forward to raking in the big dollars. And I guess we've got some interesting discussions and debates coming up, so stay tuned for that and more counter apologetics. Yeah. Oh, and thanks, Nathan, for being a guest as well.
No problem. I enjoyed it. I thought it was a really good stream. And if there's any ladies out there who are watching, James here. James is very knowledgeable if you're into NDEs and research and everything. He's your man. He's on the Discord now. You can come and talk to him there.
Yep, got queues lining up outside as we speak. Cool. Thanks, guys, and talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.